Yep, perfect. Oh, I think we have one up here.
Oh no, sorry. Sorry.
Yeah. We do. Yes. If I could have you take your seats, please. We're going to be beginning shortly. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Libby Sobek. I'm from the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. I'm just going to here to mention a couple housekeeping items before our event goes live today. This event is being streamed by Wisconsin Eye, by Will's YouTube page, and we also have PBS Wisconsin here with us today. So a couple of notes, we really encourage you to ask questions. And so if you have a question during our Q&A session, please raise your hand and someone will come to you and bring a microphone. If you need to leave, we ask you just watch the cameras and sort of duck a little bit. You should be good, but going straight back is perfect. And then during the intermission, everything goes down. So you'll have about 20 minutes to mingle, grab some coffee, water, a cookie, go to the bathroom, and then we'll be starting back again promptly at 2:20. And then finally, at the end of the event, we really hope you'll stick around, tour this gorgeous facility, and join us for a cocktail and a snack. So we're gonna go live here in about a minute, but thank you all for being here.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim Desautel, and my privilege to be the president of the GRACE, or the Green Bay Area Catholic Education System. We welcome everyone here today. We're hosting a wonderful event this afternoon. It's sponsored by the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, the American Enterprise Institute, and also our event sponsors, Carl and Mary Keeney. Thank you very, very much. I would also like to introduce in the back, Bill Mitch is our chair of our GRACE Board of Trustees. Bill, raise your hand. Thank you, Bill, for being here in person as well. We welcome everyone that's watching from afar. So today we gather. The space that we are here in person is Notre Dame of De Pere School. It is a state-of-the-art facility. It hosts 90,000 square feet for our school children that will be starting school a week from Thursday. As I tell the teachers and I tell the principals, the children are coming. It was recently built. Last year was our first year to open the doors, and this will be our second year that we open a week from Thursday, as I stated. Grace Schools, or the Grace Catholic School System, consists of 9 schools, reaching all the way up to 8th grade. One of our schools will start in 9th grade next year as well. We have about 2,300 students overall. We partner with 23 parishes. That's a lot of partnerships and a lot of holding hands. We are the second largest private school system in the state of Wisconsin. In our faith approach, we offer quite a bit. We offer quite a bit in terms of our scholarly programs for our children. We offer an IB program, or an International Baccalaureate. We have world languages of Spanish, Latin, and Mandarin. We have a Montessori program, STREAM initiatives. We have one school that's starting a bilingual program this year as well, and programs such as Project Lead the Way. So we're really pleased and really happy to offer all kinds of amenities to our families. We have rigorous academic outcomes, we have very, very high standards, and we lead with a faith approach. We're gathered here today to talk about the future of education, and I'd like to pass this along and share with you the principal of Notre Dame of De Pere Schools. This is Molly Mayers. This is Molly's 4th year to start. She is a rigorous leader focusing like a laser on children and their education, and really, really strong relationships with families. Molly will introduce some of our best and our brightest. Mrs. Mayers.
Thanks, Kim. We are so grateful to be partnering to host this event and are proud to be a part of any conversation that continues to move education forward. We'll begin our time together, as we always do as a school community, with prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance. Joining us to lead our prayer and pledge are students Margaret and Maddie Lassay. The Lassay family has been a part of our school community for a number of years, as both of their parents were also alumni of Notre Dame. Margaret, who is going into 4th grade this year, will lead our prayer for us, followed by Maddie, who will be in 2nd grade, leading our Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand if you are able.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Lord, I am thankful for everything you have given me. I am thankful for my family and friends, my teachers, priests, and government officials. I am thankful for the love you give us each and every day of our lives. Please, Lord, watch over us and keep us safe. Lord, please guide us on the right path with the Holy Spirit. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, girls. Beautiful. Please be seated. It's also my pleasure and my honor to introduce our speakers for today in this first segment. We know you well. Mike Gallagher represents the 8th Congressional District in Wisconsin, encompassing Green Bay and Northeast Wisconsin, a Marine Corps veteran, of course. Representative Gallagher sits on the House Committee in Armed Services, also is a ranking member of the Subcommittee on Military Personnel. He's also on the Committee of Transportation and Infrastructure. You're a 7th-generation Wisconsinite, born and raised in Green Bay, and you work to help our entire state of Wisconsin provide a high-quality education to every single child. So we thank you for your service. I'll go ahead and introduce also the co-speaker for this first segment as well. Frederick Hess is a senior fellow. He's the director of Ed Policy Studies for the American Enterprise Institute, or we know of as AEI. Rick works on K-12 higher education issues. He's the author of Education Week's popular Rick Hess Straight Up. We know that well. Is a regular contributor to Forbes and The Hill, and serves as an executive editor of Education Next. He was a career high school teacher, social studies teacher, and since then has taught at prestigious schools including Rice, Harvard, Georgetown, and the University of Virginia. Lots of authorships and books. He holds an MA as well as a PhD in government and also a Master's of Education in Curriculum from Harvard. So we welcome, without further ado, Congressman Gallagher and Dr. Hess.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Although, okay, we're having technical difficulties, of course. And I can put that down. I'm getting great direction from the back here. Rick, can you hear us?
I can hear you, Congressman.
Okay,
Can you
great.
hear me?
I can hear you. I'm not sure we can see you right now. So you're sort of the voice of
I am,
God being boomed in through the room here. But maybe
I've been told that the host has stopped my video.
Yeah.
So if you would let me in.
Well,
we're good to go.
as we troubleshoot, Rick, and we wait to see your wonderful face, maybe I will stall by thanking a few people here. First of all, thank you to Kim Desatel and just the entire Grace community for your leadership. And, you know, I was, you know, midway through this process that led to me publishing this piece. I'd spent a lot of time after, you know, getting calls from parents across Northeast Wisconsin about what was happening in our schools and just concerns about, you know, how do we navigate this tricky dilemma with coronavirus and school shutdowns and digital learning. And oftentimes I would just pick up the phone and call Kim. And, you know, I was joking the other day when I saw her at another event that her job was probably, there we go, Rick. How are you, sir?
I'm good, Congressman. Good to be with you.
Good.
And Libby, good to be with all of you.
And Kim, you've exhibited such great leadership the past year. We really thank you. Principal Molly Mayers, thank you so much. This facility is absolutely incredible. My wife is a Notre Dame alum, but it was a bit different when she went there. So I went to Holy Family, so don't hold that against me. And to Will, the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, and AEI for co-sponsoring this event. I mean, it's just great that we're able to bring these two incredible organizations that are doing such great work together. And so, Rick, I want to thank you. I mean, you've long been a national leader on education reform, and it's just great that we convinced you to spend some time taking all the work you've done and maybe putting it in a Wisconsin context. So with that, I'll stop talking and look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be with you. You know, especially at this moment, I think those of us on the right have a huge obligation and opportunity to lead because our friends on the left are choosing not to lead. But the question is, lead where and lead towards what? And so I got to tell you, I mean, I thought, you know, when you reached out and shared the draft of what turned into this Wisconsin 2030 report, Congressman, I think I told you at the time, I was just delighted. I mean, to see folks who've got lots of other things on their plate, national security issues, and you come at this with not an you know, you've got a lot of education, but you're not somebody who has spent their career thinking about education. So to see you step up with such an audacious vision and reach out, I told you at the time, I was impressed and delighted, and I'm even more so at the final report. But I got to ask you, and I think folks might be curious, how did you decide to dig into this so deep? I mean, given all of the issues and all of your experience, like, it doesn't necessarily suggest to me that you're a guy who's going to be thinking about career technical education and K-12 and empowering families to drive productive change in education. How did you kind of find yourself on this?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I think there's a tendency, particularly among federal legislators, just to sort of, the reflex move is to say, well, education is a local issue, education is a state issue. There's a very limited role for education with the federal government. And I sort of believe that philosophically, but obviously, as I'm sure we'll tease out in this discussion, there are areas of significant overlap. But really, I think three things combined that inspired me to kind of work on this for a little bit. The first is the most consistent thing I've heard in the 5 years that I've been in office in talking to people all over Northeast Wisconsin, at least economically, has been that they're having trouble finding workers, right? This obviously was exacerbated as a result of the pandemic, but it's a problem that predates the pandemic. It really doesn't matter what industry, it doesn't matter what size of business. You talk to people and they'll say, we can't find people to work that have the basic skills, that can pass a drug test, and that are willing to show up to work. It is a huge problem, and it's a big limiting factor for our growth in Wisconsin, a state where really our superpower is a culture of humble hard work, right? We don't have some of the natural advantages or the, you know, nice weather all year round, though the summer is fantastic in Wisconsin, that some other states do. So there is that. I mean, that has been the most consistent thing I've heard for the past 5 years in office. And then, of course, you know, about 18 months ago, we all found ourselves dealing with this devastating pandemic, and, you know, parents dealing with the fact that in many cases their kids couldn't go to school, and all of the dilemmas that caused for their daily lives, as well as just the general concerns about the limits of digital education, learning loss over the course of a year. And then you add on to that, and related, I think, just some of the really tense things we saw in our state related to conversations about racial injustice. A lot of this culminated in violence in big cities, in Wisconsin. And so I became sort of obsessed with thinking through that problem through the lens, both the workforce problem as well as the pandemic and sort of social unrest problem in Wisconsin through the lens of education. I just started calling every smart education person I knew. I started talking to education reformers in Milwaukee. I became obsessed with Will Flanders' Twitter feed and would email him at all hours of the day. I talked to people like Henry Tyson in Milwaukee, who coached me on how to understand and interpret forward exam results. And I was struck by the fact that really if you can Google, forward exam results for most public middle schools in this district, you'll see some really troubling statistics, particularly for African-American kids and Hispanic kids in Wisconsin. And so it just occurred to me that Wisconsin, which was, is known as a leader in education reform and has a proud history in education reform, seems to be following the same direction as America in terms of educational outcomes, which is to say going from the upper echelon increasingly towards the middle of the pack. And as someone who spends a lot of time focused on U.S. national security, U.S.-China competition, I just don't know how you win that competition if we don't have the best educational system in the world. And I don't know how Wisconsin distinguishes itself and solves its workforce challenges without having the best K through 12 education system in the country. And there was a third thing. My wife had a baby for the first time, and all these abstract conversations about K through 12 suddenly became very real when I considered that I have some responsibility to ensure this little human being gets educated at some point. So I don't know if any of that makes sense. The final thing I'd say, Rick, is I had a lot of concern about putting my thoughts out there in this report, precisely because this is not an area of expertise for me. And though I worked hard on this report, I had the help of Quentin, who destroyed my initial draft and helped me rebuild it. I knew there's a lot of experts at the state level. A lot are here, state legislators we have here today, a lot of experts at Will and at the national level. And I just was worried that this would be ridiculed. And so I just bring that up to say I'm conscious of the fact that this is not just a blueprint for solving every problem. This is intended to start a debate and a discussion, because it strikes me, at least as a conservative in Wisconsin, sometimes we just rely too heavily on talking points related to school choice. And my big realization was that school choice, while wonderful, I believe is a necessary but insufficient condition for success. And we have to think about how we build off the foundation of choice and what else is part of our education agenda.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said. I mean, one of my frustrations for 20 years has been school choice is a hugely important part of this. School choice can, solves a crucial problem for families who are trapped in miserable schools. Expanding educational choices can help families who kind of like their school but need something else get what they need. But it says nothing about what do we do when a kid turns 18 and we're sending them out of school. It says nothing about what about parents who don't want to pay a fortune for colleges that aren't going to actually teach their kid anything. What does it say about how? There's just a lot of questions that people have, rightfully so. And, we need to offer them actionable, thoughtful responses about here's how we're going to lead, and not just default to shrugging and saying, well, we don't know. Which brings me to actually one of the things that I think is real interesting that you've thought about is you write this report as a member of Congress, but this is obviously not a call for federal action. It's very much a state-centered vision. So I'm kind of curious, how do you think about the appropriate relationship between federal and state leaders when it comes to these issues that you sketch of educational improvement?
Well, as I alluded to at the outset, I do think primarily we rightfully think of education as a local and state issue. But one area where I was surprised to see overlap as I dug into the research and the data in ways that I didn't really anticipate at all was when it comes to teachers and teacher preparation. And maybe just pause for a second to thank all of our teachers, some of whom are no doubt here today. Just think of everything that they have been through this past year and the difficulties of having to adapt and do digital learning, not being able to see in some cases because of masks, sort of the reaction among their students and get that feedback. We owe our teachers a great debt of gratitude. And I fear because of some disagreement sometimes we may have with teachers unions, at sometimes we don't have as much of a an appreciation for teachers who are being asked to do a very, very difficult job and whose workload is only increasing every single day. So to all the teachers out there, thank you for everything you do. And Kim and Molly have promised to give all of you a raise after this event today. Just kidding. Just kidding. So the state aspect of this, as I see, the opportunity we have is to open up the aperture in terms of who is able to teach in Wisconsin. So for example, we have a master educator licensure program. One of the things I recommend in there is actually turning that into something that comes with more financial rewards as well as more prestige. So making our master teachers a designation you can get, not just because you actually got a master's degree, which may be of dubious value, but at your willingness to stay in the classroom and mentor the next generation of teachers. Because it seems to me the incentives right now are somewhat misaligned. The incentives, if you're a teacher who wants to make more money, are not always to stay in the classroom, but in some cases go into administration. And as Will and others at WILL, capital WILL, have shown in their work, we have a growing imbalance of administrators to teachers that I don't think is healthy for our educational system. But if you had a pathway that incentivized people economically to stay in the classroom and train that next generation, and then you allowed people who don't come from a college of education, but are able to pass a praxis exam and have a bachelor's degree and are willing to spend a year in an apprenticeship program with a master teacher, then you can get a lot of other people in the teaching profession. And of course, we have a looming teacher shortage in the state as well as the country. And then I think where things really get interesting, particularly if you're worried about the lack of diversity within our teacher core, and we have about, 32% of our public school students are non-white, but only 5% of our teachers are. Well, 52% of our paraprofessionals in the top 5 school districts are non-white. And that's a huge pool of talent that's just sitting on the sideline, in part because they may not be able to finish their bachelor's degree. So if we were able to use career transition funds where they do 2 years kind of getting a certificate or getting credit in a specific area they want to teach, combine that with 2 years of apprenticeship with a master teacher, then you can start to get those paraprofessionals in a place where they can teach. So that's sort of the state angle. I think the state really can do a lot to raise the ceiling for teachers and reward and appreciate teachers for actually teaching and producing excellence in the classroom. And I can go to the federal angle, but maybe Rick, given your work on this, because I stole a lot of this from your work, I'll pause there and then we can talk about the role of the federal government, which I see as kind of raising the floor at the same time that the state can raise the ceiling.
Well, I mean, the reason think tanks exist is so that folks who are elected to positions of trust will hopefully steal our ideas. So bless you. And B,
I footnoted you, Rick, so I didn't plagiarize it. Yeah.
B, you articulate it better than I do. So, it's fantastic. I mean, let's play this out a bit, because for folks who haven't thought about this as much, it's an interesting opportunity. I mean, one of the things that our friends on the left get trapped in is they wind up having to be the folks charged with subsidizing the status quo. They've got strong relationships with school administrators, with unions. So it's just very hard for them to do anything other than try to put more money into the existing formulas, because somebody's going to buck and scream. Folks like our friends at WILL, me, you, we don't necessarily feel constrained in the same ways. So we're able to ask ourselves, wait a minute, if we respect the heck out of the teaching profession, and we want to think about how do we make sure teachers do their best work, how might we think differently about the profession and pay and all the rest? So, one thing I'd love to hear you riff on a bit is I've talked in the past about, we have this strange notion in most professional roles, we don't talk about bonuses. When you talk to doctors and when you talk to architects, their professional trajectory is not really, can I land a big bonus this year? It's, can I get promoted into a role with growing responsibility and opportunity? Usually we think of bonuses as something where you're in a transactional field. You're an insurance sales agent. You're a broker. Yet when we've talked about more pay for teachers a lot, we've talked about it kind of using that insurance framework. Can we give them a bonus for moving test scores? And what I hear you talking about is, wait a minute, let's think about teachers more like architects, more like healthcare professionals, more like, folks in white-shoed law firms who are trying to grow in their expertise and their role. And we're going to let them own more responsibility and mentor more colleagues and do more good. And along with that, you start to have much bigger opportunities for making more money, well-deserved money, without having to leave what you love and without having to become another administrator. So I'm kind of curious, as you've talked to folks in Wisconsin, if that is the goal, where are some of the levers that folks suggested to you as far as what the state could do or should do to start incrementally move us towards more of a vision like that?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. This was a key area where I think I, in the process of researching this, had to revise a lot of my priors, because I did come in kind of with the basic idea that, well, if you increase pay, you'll solve all the problems. Just pay people for performance, and that. But I've sort of come to believe, as you lay out, that pay is important, but prestige and progress, for lack of a better term, are just as, if not more, important. And by the latter, I mean just that sense of autonomy and mastery and purpose you have by being free to do what you do best in the classroom, and believing that within your school, that once your kids graduate, they will continue on that path of progress that you started with them. That's why some of the early childhood literacy recommendations you see in the report, I think, are so important. What are some of the levers that we can start to pull? Well, the state has it within their power to completely reimagine the master teacher program and start to open the aperture for people that don't go to a college of education to get into teaching, as I suggested. It is kind of absurd to me that, I use my GI Bill to get my PhD. I could teach at a college or a university in Wisconsin, but I couldn't teach at a public high school. I'm not sure that makes that much sense. The only organization whose incentives are weirder than that are Congress itself. But maybe this is a good way to talk about the federal role. I do think the federal government can actually, if the state can raise the ceiling and start to put some more enticing carrots out there for people to stay in the classroom and mentor the next generation, not just in terms of pay, but also in terms of prestige and freedom. I think the federal government can wield some very important sticks. So for example, I mentioned the Praxis exam in Wisconsin. About 20% of our students who take that fail. And for non-white students, that number jumps up to 70%. And for far more difficult exams for, say, becoming a nurse, the passage rate is 91%. So something is amiss in terms of how we officially train teachers to go into our public schools. And I think the federal government could, for example, demand in return for access to teach grants that passage rate be up at 85%, to put some pressure on the colleges of education and our teacher training programs to up their standards. In this, I will confess to having been influenced by some of the research in the book, the Smartest Kids in the World, and how they got that way. And you see some of the educational powerhouses internationally are ones that insist upon extremely high standards for their teachers, not just over credentialing, but high standards in terms of the tests they're able to pass and what they're actually able to do in the classroom. So that's one area where the federal government can play a constructive role, as well as, I think, demanding more transparency from our educational training programs on passage rates, how they do when ranked against other states in the country. And if they don't comply with those transparency measures, then we can increase the penalties that currently are about $23,000 to $150,000. By the way, that's an idea I stole from Tim Kaine, who's a Democratic senator. So a lot of this is a bipartisan conversation, and there are ways in which the federal government can sort of raise the floor for what we demand from our teacher training programs. At the same time, the state opens up the mechanism through which people can become official teachers and get in the classroom, if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, Congressman. But I think a lot of folks are probably half nodding and half thinking, geez, I'm a little nervous about opening the door to get Washington into playing this role, because it seems like there's not natural circuit breakers. You invite the Federal Department of Education in, and they start expanding their grant of responsibility. How do you think about that? How is that a concern for you? If so, how do you address it?
It's a huge concern. It's not, they're already in, right? I mean, it's not like suddenly we're inviting them in. So if you want the role of the federal government to lessen over time, or if you just want the role of higher education and educational programs and credentialing teachers to lessen over time, as I think would be constructive, then there are certain things you need to do in order to get there. And so what I'm recommending is a more constructive role for the federal government. And at the same time, at the state level, again, if we open up non-traditional pathways for teachers, I do think you're going to see the role of the federal government and the role of our colleges of education reduce over time.
Now, one thing that comes out of when we talk about higher standards in other nations for entering the teaching profession, one of the realities is most of those nations also have a smaller number of teachers relative to the number of kids, so they can be more selective. They have larger class sizes. How do you think about that trade-off? Should we be maybe thinking about being more selective, but having a smaller workforce of teachers working with the number of kids? Or is there a way to square that circle where we can have as many people as today and still have significantly higher standards?
Well, I mean, Rick, as I think some of your research has suggested, there was a big emphasis on reducing class sizes for a long period of time. And I think it's fair to say the results of that were mixed. And as a result, I guess on balance, I'd rather have a smaller class than a bigger one, but so much just depends on the quality of the teacher. I mean, I think an absolute great teacher, even in a facility that isn't as nice as Notre Dame, can do, and with a big class, can do great things that a less qualified and experienced teacher simply can't do. So I would hesitate to prescribe a one-size-fits-all model, particularly one that was dictated by the federal government. And I do think there's a tendency sometimes, and I tried to guard against this in the report, though I just mentioned that book, it was a great book. There's a tendency sometimes to think, well, South Korea does it this way. All these Scandinavian countries do it this way. Or, if only we can do it the way Singapore does it, we would just be phenomenal. Well, these are very different places, right? I mean, Singapore is a huge city state. The same thing happens in other policy areas like healthcare. And so I just think we have to be very careful about our ability to sort of copy and paste other models, while at the same time we look to learn from those models and experiment with them from the bottom up. And I just would like to get the state of Wisconsin back in the business of experimenting from the bottom up before we go down we're going to prescribe the precise ratio for Madison or Milwaukee or Green Bay or Howard Suamico, if that makes sense.
Makes a ton of sense. And just, a fun factoid for folks in attendance, it's useful to keep in mind that if we have the same class size today, not the same class size, same student to teacher ratio today that we had a half century ago, today we have a teacher for about every 14 students across the nation. Half a century ago, we had a teacher for every 27 students. If we kept that, and nationally, average teacher pay today would be about $130,000. So that would be the average. We made a choice, largely at the behest of the NEA and AFT, to add lots of bodies, but the more people you hire, the harder it is to pay everybody well.
Yeah.
And, I mean, there's trade-offs here. We know this. When you talk about bottom-up strategies, Congressman, obviously this brings a lot back to local decision-making, to school boards and what superintendents are doing with their authority. And you've got some interesting thoughts to share in the report about how to empower voters and communities to make sure they're able to play a more active role in engaging with their school boards and steering them. And that seems, given the national, debates we're having right now about critical race theory and around masking and reopening, it seems a particularly timely piece of the report. Wonder if you could share a little bit about how, what you suggest and how you kind of got there.
Yeah. Well, I should confess, I've gotten some pushback from conservatives that the debate over critical race theory didn't play a bigger role in the report. I should say when I drafted it over a year ago, the debate hadn't really manifested itself. But this is the recommendation that if that concerns you, if you're a parent, or if just the way, a school shutdown or move to digital learning concerns you, this to me is the best way to get engaged. The high ground in that fight is a focus on school board elections. And I do think one of the longest lasting effects of the pandemic is going to be to convince a lot of parents, conservative and non-conservative, to pay more attention to school board election. In Wisconsin, these are off-cycle elections. They're extremely low turnout. Let's be honest, even those of us who do politics for a living, we go in the booth and we look at the names, and you don't know what these people ran on or stand for, because when it comes time for my election at the federal level, people have been inundated with TV ads. They're sick of seeing me. There's more attention paid to those elections, but there's just not enough attention paid to school board election. And is there anything more important than our kids' education? And this is a $12.7 billion enterprise, and we're handing the keys to it, even though only 1 in 5 Wisconsin voters actually participates in the election. So to me, it makes sense. And this is an idea that I poached from educational reformers in Milwaukee. And Milwaukee, remember, has had this debate about, do you put MPS under, the mayor of Milwaukee? How do you improve the governance structure? Should there be a separate LEA for choice schools, for charter schools, et cetera, et cetera? One thing that I think would help and would simplify our overall election process at a time when there's a lot of concerns about the complexity of it would just be to align the school board elections with the normal partisan election schedule. And for those of you who say, no, school board elections need to be nonpartisan, I just think we're fooling ourselves to think that they are nonpartisan right now. They may not always neatly fall on left-right lines or neatly map onto Democrat and Republican preferences, but they're intensely partisan. And we have partisans and special interests that exploit the low turnout nature of our existing elections to effectively install their preferred candidates, right? There's been no competition or intellectual diversity or debate associated with the state superintendent election for 3 decades now in Wisconsin, which gets to the other change that I think is very hard, as the state legislators here know, which I think I stole from the Kettle Commission report back in the 90s, whenever that was published. All I did was just steal things in the course of a year. I don't think it makes any sense for Wisconsin to have an elected state superintendent with really no oversight from a state school board. We are unique in the country with an elected state superintendent that isn't accountable to either the legislature or a state school board or the governor. To me, it makes far more sense to make that a governor-appointed position so that people can hold governors accountable for educational outcomes in our state. Because right now it strikes me you have DPI pointing fingers at the governor pointing fingers at DPI, and it's sort of like hot potato, who's actually responsible for our kids learning things in the classroom. So those are two political reforms that I think would actually result in better policy outcomes in our education and just get people paying more attention to school board. My goal is to make school board elections more important than congressional elections, and in some sense, even presidential elections. And I think conservatives who are all about local control, subsidiarity, both in a Catholic sense and in a just pure policy sense, should be excited by that very idea.
And Congressman, I think some folks might wonder, are there any implications for choice if you move to a more partisan one-cycle election? If if the head of DPI is appointed by a governor, is that good for school choice efforts? Bad for school choice efforts? No impact on choice efforts?
I don't see it being bad for school choice efforts. I mean, I assume. How could it be worse than the status quo in Wisconsin, right? At least we'd have a chance of getting a non-teachers union controlled candidate and potentially an independent candidate or a conservative candidate in DPI. I think, if anything, it would be marginally, even the worst case outcome would be marginally better for school choice advocates in Wisconsin. I guess there could be some unintended consequence that I'm not thinking about. But part of what we have in the report too is DPI right now, I don't think is unlocking some of the potentials of choice just because of the antiquated way in which it interfaces with the public. And I think there are ways in which a modernized DPI at the direction of a governor could actually, join the 21st century and give parents more options and give parents a sense that they're in control of their kids' education.
I was going to ask, you kind of anticipated the question. What would you like to see the chief of DPI focused on?
Yeah.
If you were to lay out 1 or 2 priorities for DPI to really align itself around, what would they be?
So in the report, we have a recommendation, and I do think that this is kind of I'm not saying it's easy to do, but it could be the biggest bang for your buck proposal that's in there. That for a modest investment of time and resources, I really think you could start to unlock choice in Wisconsin. If you're a parent trying to decide how and where to send your kid to school, and you go on DPI's website, you find a lot of confusing information. If you try and Google good schools in Green Bay, you find useless amounts of information, right? If you want to filter school searches based on your specific criteria for your kid's education, whether that's a pure test score approach, you just want to send your kid to the school that has the best test scores in your geographical area that you define, or whether you want to filter for sports. Let's say you want your kids to wrestle and you want to figure out who has a wrestling program and who's good at sports in your area, whatever your focus is. If you want to see which schools have creative partnerships with local industry, whether it's the Anape Youth Apprenticeship Program at Luxembourg Casco and Kewanee, or down in Brilliant with the investments Aaron's has made in the classroom, there's no way to do it right now. There's no sort of Yelp or Amazon option for parents to shop around for their kids' education. And I think it limits choice, right? And this gets back to my core insight. We sort of think as conservatives, okay, we have choice in Wisconsin. Let's just keep expanding choice and we'll get better outcomes. Well, there's a lot of things you need to layer on top of that to make choice work. And I think bringing DPI into the 21st century, at least with its web interface with the public, and then the real innovation would be that to make that the way parents register for schools, that's when things could start to get very exciting. So that's kind of a technical recommendation, but I think one that has a lot of promise and at least would allow parents to feel like they're not drowning in information. I say that as someone who, it took me a long time to be able to interpret board exam results, the way in which we grade schools. Flanders has done some great, I have to say Flanders because Will is an organization and your name is Will as well. There's a lot of controversy about the way in which DPI awards these grades to schools. At a time when we have 60% of our kids can't read at grade level, yet the majority of MPS schools get sort of A-OK, good job from DPI. Something doesn't add up there. And so it's very difficult for a parent to spend the time looking through antiquated websites and old Excel spreadsheets and really come away with meaningful knowledge about the options they have for their kids. So that's one way in which a reimagined state superintendent and DPI being held accountable by the governor and the legislature, I think could have a positive impact on educational results in our state. And it wouldn't require any federal involvement to do that. So it's a double whammy.
I love it. One thing when we think about the federal role, I mean, one of the things Democrats in Washington seem intent on right now is getting everybody to go to college and then making college free and then forgiving all the loans people borrowed to go to law school where they can't actually pay off their law school loans, and then complaining that this is, problematic. You, in your report, take a different tack at the state level, talking about the importance of kind of non-college alternatives, particularly apprenticeship models and technical schools. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the apprenticeship and technical alternatives here and what you have in mind and how you sketch it in the report, and give folks a sense of how does that take a different tack or a competing tack or I suppose, complementary tack to the conversations in Washington right now?
Well, and just a quick save round on the previous strand. If you wanted to search based on safety, right, and analyze which schools have public resource officers, right? I was just in the western part of the state, and there was a lot of school board members complaining that their schools stopped paying police officers to protect their schools, right? If that was important to you as a parent, there's no obvious way to get that data right now. I mean, obviously you can call around, you can go through your informal network, but my point is that should all be readily available and easily displayed. I mean, we have the tools to do this and we're just not doing it right now. On your point about college, this is really important because usually when I have those conversations about workforce issues and we can't find workers, the next thing people will say to me is, well, not every kid needs to go to a four-year college. I'm like, amen. I totally agree. And it'll be parents that will say this to me, not every kid needs to go to a four-year college. And then I'll follow up and I'll say, well, what about your kid? And they'll say, well, my kid's going to a four-year college, right? Because I still think there's a stigma associated with. I still think we have a long way to go towards celebrating non-college pathways or going right into Fox Valley Tech or NWTC. There's some cool things happening, to be sure, that I want to highlight. I mean, down in Kaukauna, the local 400 guys do an apprenticeship signing day, which is really cool. It's like when the good athlete in your high school, which is not me, by the way, got signed with a college, committed to a college. There would be, they do a whole thing at the school and you'd celebrate this achievement. They're doing that for kids that are going into the workforce, into the trades, working with their hands. That's great. I think that gets to the cultural issue we have and the destigmatization of it. I mentioned Anape Youth Apprenticeship. I mentioned what's happening in Brilliant, multiple ways in which our anchor companies are investing in the high schools early, not just out of the goodness of their heart, because they want workers. They want people to stay there and work in the company. So we're changing it over time, but we have a long way to go. So what can we do to kind of put our money where our mouth is? Well, one idea that I stole from West Virginia, again, another stolen idea, is this concept of a apprenticeship saving account or a blue collar 529. We've tried to make some tweaks in recent years at the federal level, and this is an area where the federal government currently has a role to play, right? Good, bad, or ugly. It is what it is. We got to make it better. We've tried to make some tweaks to 529s in recent years, but it hasn't really worked. So how do you turn that EdVest account into something that you can use to not just go to a technical college, which currently you can use it for that, but to pay for tools, to pay for a certificate program, to pay for the costs just associated with starting a business? That to me is exciting. At a minimum, we should seek to learn from the experiment that West Virginia is conducting right now and whether it works for them or not. The second thing you can do is actually reform the eligibility for Pell Grants so that you don't need to be enrolled in a semester-long program to be able to access that, right? So change the threshold from 600 hours to 150 hours to get at those mid-career transition folks who might just need a month-long intensive program or something that lasts the same length as a semester, but isn't actually a semester credit because you're going part-time while working. And then the third thing, I think, build upon some of the success. Governor Walker and our legislators deserve a lot of credit for trying to revitalize and reimagine our technical college system in Wisconsin. And we've made a lot of progress, but we can continue that progress by continuing to invest in our Fast Forward program so that industry really has a voice in terms of how we design courses and how we counsel our kids on what courses are right for them. So those are a lot of things we can do to put our money where our mouth is. The second thing is within high school itself, at a time when we put so much emphasis on AP courses and college credit, I really think we need to place the same level of energy and emphasis on dual enrollment courses in technical colleges in particular. We have Vanessa here with us today, who is also in charge of using one of the secret weapons that Wisconsin has, thanks to the legislature. About in 2015, I believe, the legislature gave every UW chancellor the ability to charter schools. Wouldn't it be cool, and I know Vanessa is working on this, if they use that authority, right, to pioneer some, as Purvis has informed me, some innovative states like Michigan are doing, to really start to create more K through 14 options where we're graduating high school seniors as college juniors, or at least as 18-year-olds that can survive in a very competitive workplace. That's ultimately where I think we need to go. And the final thing I'd say, at the risk of angering Ray Cross, who I see in the back here, I didn't imagine having every smart education person in Wisconsin in front of me as I run my mouth for an hour, but that's where we are. I have a recommendation in there about how we can take our 2 years and collapse them into our technical college system. The area, Ray, and this isn't part of the report, but where we might disagree is, do you then over the long term have to consolidate the comprehensives in Wisconsin just in order to save money or eliminate duplicative facilities and coursework? And can you recycle some of the assets these colleges own? I know that's a very controversial issue, but I do think that there's going to be a lot of 4-year comprehensives that are struggling to survive a decade from now. I think the pandemic has unleashed sort of an inevitable set of efficiencies related to higher education that we really need to grapple with. And Wisconsin needs to be at the leading edge of digital education, at least for higher education. At the same time, we're realizing the limits for early childhood education with digital learning. So those are sort of 3 areas that I think we can put our money where our mouth is and not just play lip service to the idea that everyone needs to pick up a hammer and, go work with their hands and get dirty every single day.
I love it. I think we want to open it up for questions. Congressman, I think one thing also, building on what you just said, though, for folks to noodle on, is I think this disconnect you flag between parents. You talk to folks who are like, not everybody needs to go to college. My kid needs to go to college.
Yeah.
Part is the recognition that, look, those of us, me and all of you in this room, we probably all went to college. It's the people who get to sit around, to drink lattes and wear our ties and kind of make six figures for not working too hard, who have the college degrees. And folks are cognizant of that, and they don't want their kids to be able to get a slice of that. So I think one of the things we need to think about is, look, there are a lot of really talented, skilled people who don't have a college degree, but who wind up getting bottled out of these kinds of jobs that they'd be good at, might want to do. And I think we also need to take a look at employment law and about the norms that have been built into how these companies hire and promote, which create a whole bunch of legal and cultural impediments that make people feel like they have to go ahead and pay and buy that degree, want it or not, because they don't want their kid to get locked out of the good life 10, 20 years downstream. And I just think, it's an important part for us all to be thinking about while we tackle the very practical challenges you sketched.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and open it up for questions from the audience.
Oh, do you need this? As you get a question, just a quick riff on that, Rick. I think, well,
Yes,
beyond
please.
sort of, obviously we're having this debate about the extent to which we're paying people not to work right now at the federal level, and I do think we are, which is a problem. Part of this, as I sort of started with, is just getting the word out. I mean, there are some incredible opportunities right now. I mean, you graduate from the Great Lakes Energy Education Center at NWTC, they have like 100% placement rate, and their median salary I'm talking 19-year-old kids, because it's less than a year to graduate. Their median salary is like $60,000. I mean, and you don't have debt really, right? I mean, the more we just apprise kids of these opportunities, or you could be making a Navy ship up in Marinette and making a ton of money. You could be making a Joint Light Tactical Vehicle down in Oshkosh and be making a ton of money. Like, the more we get the word out there, I think we'll start to chip away at the cultural stigma, particularly if we compare that with, the over-credentialed person, maybe I'm evidence of this, that, isn't doing as well economically right now with a useless degree.
No, that's right. The liberal arts major with $100,000 in debt so that they can, make $18 an hour, working at a job that doesn't require the degree. Part of this too, I mean, you're exactly right. Part of it's getting the word out, but here's also a place where, say, state government can lead, because in theory, civil service hiring promotion codes always have those tracks for practical experience or credentials. And reality, the way that these things have been done to avoid, messy kind of employment actions, and because it's convenient, because they have degrees, is the practical track has frequently been degraded over time or just kind of lapsed into unuse. And so you really functionally need that credential to get considered for the job. And what we need is those guys who are getting the $60,000 a year gig and getting the 10-month training when they're ready for that next stage in their life, when they're 28 or 38 and they're ready to move on.
Yeah.
They need to be confident that somebody's not going to tell them, okay, you need a timeout from your life where you spend a lot of time earning a unnecessary piece of paper. They've got to be confident that they are going to be considered for opportunities and promotion based on their skills and knowledge and work ethic. And I worry too often that that doesn't feel like the playing field that people are looking at too often.
Great questions. Hard questions will go to Rick.
Good afternoon. Twice in my life, I've been called by a sitting congressman, cold called. First one was my own congressman, so it wasn't a big deal, but then it was you. You called me wanting to talk about charter schools, and we talked about all kinds of things, and I think it was primarily reading, so I'm delighted to see the recommendations you have regarding to improving reading instruction across the state, because I think that's vital to changing things around. But side note on something that you mentioned along the way here, one of the things that has become apparent is that parents have become engaged in their child's education again. We're seeing massive crowds show up at school board meetings, and granted, it's not necessarily about academics.
That's right.
That's why they're showing up. but they're showing up. And I think that it is a result of the peak inside the classroom they got through virtual education. And one of the reasons that, while I have a lot of opinions, being a legislator on education and a former teacher, I have been begging for years for people to get to their school board meetings. What is your viewpoint on how we sustain this? Or do we win this battle and then we just kind of all crawl back into our normal lives again, and all of a sudden the school boards are run by liberal organizations?
Well, thank you for the question. And more importantly, thank you for the time that you spent to educate me as I asked a variety of dumb questions about this. Just quickly on early childhood literacy, I don't know if it was you or Howard Fuller or someone I talked to that had said, the reading wars are over, phonics won. So let's just recognize that and build upon it. Maybe it's you, Rick. I don't know. But I think this is a very good thing, notwithstanding the more controversial manifestations of that school board interest that you allude to. And we've all seen the videos of school board meetings devolving into yelling, whether it's from, protesters coming in or just parents that are just devastated. I just think that engagement is a good thing. And I do believe we can sustain it over time by putting some points on the board, right? I mean, it's one thing for us to sit here and talk about, school boards are so important, everyone needs to pay attention, or log on to Facebook when your school board meeting is happening. But the rubber meets the road when we start recruiting and fielding good candidates that can win school board elections, right? And that's where I think we, particularly those of us in public office, have a role to play. And where we have an opportunity is to dip into the deep reservoir of nonprofits that exist to train school board members to be effective, right? And not just act as compliance officers, but really hold schools accountable for money going in, producing better outcomes for children. And so if we do that, right, and let's be honest, it's not like we're going to turn MPS, tomorrow, right? Maybe 50 years from now or 30 years from now. But we can start to win some of these races, or at least make the school board races about key issues, not just about who has the endorsement of the teachers unions. And if we do that, I think we'll get more people interested in running, whether it's someone who, has already had success in the private sector and wants to do public service part-time, right? Or it's an ambitious young, kid right out of St. Norbert's who wants to get involved in politics and understand how local government works, and maybe one day, for some unknown reason, wants to be a member of Congress. Or it's, a retired educator who wants to continue to be involved in education. I think if we recruit those candidates, support those candidates, and train them to actually do the job effectively, we can build upon success and sustain that interest and make sure it doesn't just die down as we move on to the next shiny object or culture war controversy that we're beating each other up about, if that makes sense. Dave? Yeah.
So I'd like to start out by saying, first of all, that I would love to put a voucher in every student's backpack. But ever since the first day I walked in the state capitol, one of the things I've been most concerned about was what would happen to our private schools as vouchers proliferated. And I believe that's beginning to happen. And that is that my challengers on the other side, as they see vouchers taking a hold, they're trying to turn our private schools into quasi-public schools.
Interesting.
And they do that by controlling the testing. So if Notre Dame Academy is going to be tested on critical race theory, what does Notre Dame Academy need to teach?
That's right.
And so that's how they control it. So we have to figure out a way to protect our private schools. I really believe that unless the state controls its own testing, its own curriculum, and its own standards, that we're going to lose this battle in the long run. It will get better over the short term as we get more vouchers, but then we'll see it start to erode again.
Yeah. Dave, that's a great point. And thanks for all the work you do. There are at least 2 recommendations in the report that are intended to get at that, but I'd like to get Rick's thoughts on what he's seen at the national level, if other states have found creative ways to do this. By the way, on the state superintendent thing, I believe Indiana just changed from an elected model to an appointed model. So there's an opportunity where, we can learn from their mistake or their success as it plays out. One, we recommend having a separate LEA for choice schools, for private voucher schools, charter schools, so that one of the things we saw in the pandemic is we created a pot of ESSER funds, was those funds being filtered through an LEA. Sometimes that money was being skimmed off the top, wasn't actually getting to the schools and the classrooms in the way that we'd intended at the federal level. And I think a separate LEA, again, an idea I stole from education reformers in Milwaukee, would help. And then ultimately, I think you have to move towards a backpack funding model that treats all kids equally, right? Easy to say, harder to do. I sketched out sort of the broad vision, and now I'm throwing the hot potato in your lap at the state level to figure out the formula. But I'd invite Rick to comment on what states seem to be figuring that out. That to me is the hardest thing, because the funding formula is so complex. It involves property taxes. We have a way of fixing sort of socioeconomic inequities. Rick, who have you seen do this well? Where's it working?
It's a great question. I don't know that there's anybody I would specifically point to. My colleague Robert Pondicio is going to be on the next panel. Robert's thought a lot about this. Look, if you look at Europe, for instance, Europe has a long tradition of, a substantial private school sector in nations like Belgium and France, but they are functionally public-private schools. What they teach, when they teach it, how kids, what kids spend time doing is all regulated by the national government, even in schools that are choice schools that are private. So look, one option that states have played with is giving schools the leeway to use different standardized assessments, for instance. So rather than saying that you have to use the state assessment, at different points in time, places like Louisiana have said, all right, there's a menu. There's 3 or 4 tests that we regard as credible and reliable, and you've got to demonstrate, acceptable performance on these for kids who are attending on publicly funded vouchers. So that's certainly one avenue. A second piece, though, is that it's not just about the standardized assessments. For instance, if you follow what's going on with the Biden Department of Education, there's very much conversations under the guise of enforcing civil rights law that they are exploring dictates on access for transgender children that are not just, say, about bathroom accommodations, but requiring particular access for dormitories, say in a 9 to 12 environment at a private school. You find these same things relating to, the Biden folks are pushing the 1619 Project and, Ibram Kendi's anti-racism. So there are a variety of fronts, both kind of assessment, but also some of these more social dictates where folks in Washington or at the state level can be pushing on private schools through the mechanism of saying, hey, you're taking public funds as a charter school or by accepting a public voucher. And I think those of us who believe that parents and students deserve to have options, deserve to be able to choose the school environment that speaks to their values, that provides the kind of learning environment they want, we need to, partly it's about particular strategies for responding, but it's very specifically about the need to not let these things kind of quietly happen under the radar, but to forcefully and directly confront them. And Congressman, by the way, I'll just say that's why I think you're not just vague encouragement of folks to get involved, but specific conversation of how to enable those who are not part of the blob to make sure that they're getting a chance to speak up, to show up, to be heard, to be empowered is such an important piece of making sure that these debates over this decade and future decades are not playing out on a tilted field.
Well, I think I have time for one more question, but 2 quick comments on that. One of our concerns kind of goes in a different direction, is that the Biden Department of Education will try and eliminate all testing this year so that we don't even have a sense of how far behind our kids have fallen. I mean, that would be bad, I think. And there are kids, let's be honest, who were already behind and are now further behind. And we're going to have to do a lot of work to help them. And then just quickly, a comment on choice that made me think of, that I know, Rick, your work has really elucidated. I mean, it's great, you know, in Milwaukee that, you know, kids can access choice and go to St. Augustine Prep. Gus Ramirez just walked in. But for a kid in, you know, Oconto County, like I mean, if your choice school is 50 miles away from, you know, another school, we got to think about, that's an area where I think we can leverage technology for course choice. But in order to do that, you have to start with reimagining the funding structure, which is very difficult, but I think necessary. Final question.
So first of all, thank you both for the conversation about education. We need more of this to happen across our state. A real quick comment and then a question. You mentioned teacher pay and the importance of raising compensation, but can you talk a little bit more about teacher prestige? What are some practical and real ways to increase teacher prestige across our state, both for those in the pipeline and those coming up through the pipeline?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this was the intent behind our recommendations around a master teacher designation. At least give teachers sort of a path to advancing and to getting that professional recognition and prestige that doesn't currently exist right now. Beyond that, you know, I'm open for recommendations. You know, one of the thoughts I had in there, and I had in an earlier draft, I think there were about 30 drafts of this, and someone can probably blackmail me who has access to the first draft because it was laughable and some of the recommendations were just not ready for prime time. But I sort of talked about this in the way of, you know, I'm a veteran. Everywhere I go, people thank me for my service. Great, got it. Not trying to equate military service in a combat zone with teaching. They're two very different enterprises. But it would be nice if we sort of had that same kind of instinct for our teachers who are doing a very difficult job. And I'm not sure you can mandate it through a piece of legislation. Maybe it's a cultural change, but it's something we all need to think about. Rick, again, not to punt to you, but are there any other states that have cracked the code on that, or things you've seen that have worked? Because we have some amazing teachers here in Wisconsin, and we should recognize that.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think, you know, your veterans analogy, I think, you know, you ask Americans, how do you feel about teachers? I mean, even as frustrated as so many parents were last year, Americans were hugely appreciative of teachers. Yeah. So I think we get that soft, genial appreciation. But what I think teachers really want, and what so many great teachers deserve, is the kind of appreciation you have when you meet a cardiovascular surgeon, when you meet somebody who is great at their work. And the reality is there's 7 million Americans, say, in the health professions. We don't have that same level of prestige and appreciation for somebody who's doing genial work, you know, menial work, kind of sweeping up the hallways of the local hospital. That we appreciate it. It's a good, honorable job. But when we talk about prestige, it's people who are really making a big difference in lives. And I think one of the opportunities of what you sketch for education is it's a chance to think of it when we talk about nations where teaching is not just appreciated, but prestigious. Yeah. It's those Amanda Ripley countries that you flag. Right. It's places where it is hard to become a teacher, where being a teacher is seen as a real accomplishment. And if we're going to have lots of adults in education, that's great. And they all have a valuable role to play, and God bless every one of them. But the ones who are going to be prestigious are probably going to be the ones who are making a really big impact in children's lives, and they need to be compensated accordingly, and they need to be respected accordingly. But that's not going to be every adult in education. And so some of what we were talking about before, I think, starts to create those opportunities for the tens and hundreds of thousands of teachers in this nation who are doing extraordinary work to really be seen in the kind of light that shines down on anybody who's extraordinary at an important task.
Great. Well, with that, thus concludes our first panel. I should confess, I don't get nervous going on national TV talking about Afghanistan or China, I've been so nervous doing this. This is so outside my comfort zone. So Rick, thanks for providing some support here. And thanks to all of you for being so engaged. And you'll be happy to know that on the next panel, you get actual experts that I get to interrogate and ask questions of. So I will enjoy that far more than I enjoyed this last hour. But thank you so much. This is great. Thank you, Rick.
Hey, thank you, Congressman.
Yeah.
Again, real credit to you to do such an important and audacious document. And I sure as heck hope everybody in attendance takes the time to actually read it and engage with it. I think they'll find it enormously worth the time.
Great. All right. So we have how many minute break? 15-minute break. There are snacks out there, and then we'll reconvene in here for our next panel. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Hey, man, thanks for coming. Appreciate it. Oh, I should turn this off before I say something that will be used against me. Yeah.
Hey, my pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please come in and take a seat. We have lots of people, so we're going to encourage you to move in. So it's like church.
Space it out a little. There we go.
Oh, I'm fine. So, well, I know you. Thank you so much for being here, Shannon. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. So, yes. You hold me accountable. I put it that way. Yeah. You're a good intellectual sparring partner. Yeah. Ready to go? Do we have our virtual panelists? Robert and Joseph, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay.
It's Robert. Yes.
Okay, there we go. Well, thank you all for being here. And I'm really excited for this panel. As I mentioned, we have some actual experts. But again, thank you to Rick Hess for taking some time to do that. I've long admired Rick's work, and he pushed me a lot as I developed this report. And I couldn't sort of address every issue, but it was just really helpful to have his feedback. And you saw some of the give and take in that last conversation. And now we have an opportunity to really dig into that. We have 4 amazing panelists. The first is Robert Pondicio, who is the senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on K-12 curriculum, teaching, school choice, and charter schools. He has extensive experience as a policy analyst, most recently with the Fordham Institute, and as a teacher himself. He'll have a lot of insight in how the topics we've discussed actually work in the classroom. Also joining us is Joseph Fuller. Do we have Joseph Fuller? Oh, Joseph, there you are. Perfect. Is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also the well-published professor of management practice at Harvard Business School. I think that's a 2-year institution somewhere in Boston. He researches the future of work, workforce development, and higher education, all of which will come into play in this conversation. Of course, Will Flanders, my education Sherpa in Wisconsin at times, is a research director at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. He's an all-around expert in all things Wisconsin education, including school choice, rural education, and education spending. And he's going to contextualize these big national conversations into what we can do here in Wisconsin. And then finally, Shannon Whitworth is a Bradley Freedom Fellow at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, where he comments on education and other important issues. In addition, he is executive director of the Free Enterprise Academy at Milwaukee Lutheran High School, which is a high-performing choice school. Very much looking forward to hearing from you, Shannon, on how we can improve schools and make life easier for parents. So I figured to start the discussion, we'll start with Robert. Robert, the classroom is where the rubber meets the road on all these ideas. And I see it, as I see it, and as I've gone through the journey, we need great curriculum and we need great teaching. Can you talk about what that actually looks like in practice and about your work more broadly?
Yeah, sure. And apologies, for some reason my camera is turned off. For the tech folks who I'm getting your text, it's not on my end. I'm being told when I turn my camera on that the host has turned it off. Wise decision, perhaps, but it's not at my end. Let me just launch in, and thanks for the introduction, Congressman. So I became a teacher 20 years ago in the South Bronx in New York City, and when I was asked by the principal of PS 277 what grade I wanted to teach, I said 5th grade. And I think that's why she hired me, because she had a tough time keeping teachers in the 5th grade. just by way of background, my school, PS 277, was the lowest performing school in New York's lowest performing district. Fifth grade was the highest grade and a bit chaotic, to be honest. But I had an ulterior motive, you see, in asking to teach fifth grade. I did not know how to teach reading. I was afraid I would be found out. Well, it turns out my experience wasn't unique. I have a master's degree in elementary education, but the basic blocking and tackling of reading instruction was not part of my training. It wasn't part of my professional development either. Congressman, in your report, you cited, I was amused to see Lucy Calkins and balanced literacy. Well, I was teaching at a balanced literacy, Lucy Calkins Teachers College reading and writing. This is my video.
Now we see you.
Reading
Perfect.
and writing project. Yeah, nice to see you all. So Lucy Calkins was our curriculum, as it were. It wasn't really a curriculum, more on that in a moment. But that was the way I was brought up. I'm not going to say trained because again, I wasn't. So very early on, my TC, Teachers College, Lucy Calkins staff developer, I asked her, well, where's my curriculum? What am I supposed to be teaching? She responded rather inscrutably. She said, well, Mr. Pandisio, you're the best person to know what every child in your classroom needs. Honestly, I thought she was making fun of me. It took me the longest time to understand that she was serious. This same staff developer would speak to us in these kind of inscrutable little homilies. You know, she would encourage me to be the author of my own teaching. And then when I would take that advice seriously, she would say, well, Mr. Pandisio, you're not teaching, you're giving instructions. Another staff developer told me that TC in balanced literacy, quote, isn't a curriculum, it's a philosophy. Well, I didn't need a philosophy, I needed a curriculum. More importantly, my students needed me to have a curriculum. They didn't have the luxury of me waiting to learn how to be the author of my own teaching, as it were. Well, let me back up also by saying, look, I didn't plan on having a career in education. I signed up for a 2-year mid-career public service stint as a teacher, and I stayed, frankly, because of the issues that we're discussing today. I was just scandalized by how poorly prepared I was, and it turns out my experience was not an anomaly. A name you might know, Emily Hanford of American Public Media, in the last couple of years has produced a series of articles and podcasts on the state of reading instruction and teacher training for reading in American schools. She points out that the basic assumption that underlies reading instruction in most American schools is that reading is a natural process, much like learning to talk. But we know from decades of scientific research that reading does not come naturally. Most teachers are not being taught reading science in their teacher preparation programs. A lot of faculty and deans at colleges of education either don't know the science or they're dismissive of it. I mean, Congressman, you said before that Howard Fuller, I think, our mutual friend, said, well, the reading wars are over, phonics won. Well, that message has not necessarily reached Teachers College. And look, a lot of teachers, frankly, are angry about the fact that their teacher training does not include the so-called science of reading. They read the kinds of things that I write, that Emily Hanford writes, and they're upset. Why wasn't this covered in my teacher training program? And I also want to say, just briefly, it's important not to just say it's phonics. It's a lot more complicated than that. It's it's phonemic awareness, it's fluency, vocabulary, reading comprehension. And reading comprehension gets to the soul of what I do and write about. And the point that I would make there is that reading comprehension is not a skill that we teach, it's a condition we create. I like to describe myself as an unapologetic disciple of E.D. Hirsch Jr., who you might know from his work with cultural literacy and core knowledge. I'm on the board of the Core Knowledge Foundation. So I'll put in a pitch for knowledge-rich curriculum from the first day of school to the last, from one end of kindergarten or pre-K to 12th grade. I became a curriculum advocate as a teacher, and the reason I stayed in the field, I became a curriculum advocate almost by accident because I stumbled on Hirsch. He was the one theorist whose work described what I saw in my South Bronx classroom every day. Kids who could decode but struggled to comprehend, and what Hirsch saw that my folks, frankly, from Teachers College, the Lucy Calkins folks, did not see, was the connection between background knowledge and reading comprehension. So again, reading comprehension is not a skill, but that's the way we teach it, and that's the way we test it. We don't have the time to go into the whole background on background knowledge, But suffice it to say that language proficiency rests on shared knowledge and context that writers and speakers make assumptions about what readers and listeners know. And when we're all on the same page, the same body of background knowledge, allusions, idioms, etc., well, then that happens fluidly. In other words, then reading and language proficiency feels like a skill, but it's really not. So, my plea here, as we discuss reading and reading comprehension, is to not dismiss the essential role of education to ensure for all children a full, knowledge-rich curriculum, including history, science, art, music, etc. About the best 10 minutes that you can spend to learn more on this topic is to go home tonight and Google the phrase "teaching content is teaching reading," which is a 10-minute video produced by Dan Willingham, a cognitive scientist at University of Virginia, who explains all this as well as anybody. So look, the good news here is 20 years after I became a teacher, we're getting some religion on this, as it were. I think there's about 20 states now that have introduced some form of so-called science of reading legislation. And I'm broadly supportive of these things, but I think it's important to be clear-eyed. I mean, I don't want to sound cynical, but it's easy for policymakers to get schools to do things. It's not easy to get them to do it well. So, the idea that we could legislate our way to proficiency in reading is, you got to be clear-eyed about that. It's a lot more complicated, for example, than these, third grade reading guarantees, which just kind of assume that schools and teachers know what to do, and now you just need to put the incentive structures in place to do that. So, we can talk about some of those ideas in greater depth. But the message is, don't assume that we just have to get the incentives right, put a third grade reading guarantee in place and all will be well. Again, Congressman, in your report, you cited the example of Mississippi, and that's a really good example. They're doing more than a third grade reading guarantee. They've got curriculum initiatives, professional development, school leadership. A friend of mine says, and I like to steal this quote, he says, there's no magic bullet for reading, but there might be magic buckshot. And what that means is you've got to get a lot of things, all heading in the same direction to get the results. So Mississippi is a pretty good example, and we can talk about some others. The bottom line is I choose to be kind of guardedly optimistic about these impulses to, again, legislate our way to reading proficiency. I'm long out of the business of wanting to impose my will on schools. I have some very, well-defined preferences in terms of curriculum instruction. But if there's any exception to that general impulse to not want to impose, it's probably around the science of reading and early childhood literacy, because your point is very well taken. We really do know how to teach reading. We really do know what works. And if there's an effective role for policymakers, it's to at least ensure that all schools in a state or district are honoring what we know about the so-called science of reading. The last comment I'll make, responding to your report, Congressman Gallagher, is I share your appreciation for the call to recruit and prepare great teachers. I guess I would nuance it somewhat with a dose of realism. There aren't many hills that I'm willing to die on in this work, but this will be one of them. We have 3.7 million teachers in the United States of America. If you have that many people doing any job, you're going to have a range. From teachers who you would be delighted to have your child in his or her classroom to folks who might really should be doing something else for a living. So you can't kind of predicate school improvement and better outcomes on saints and superstars, so to speak. Donald Rumsfeld did not say, but he could have. You go to school with the teachers you have, not the teachers you wish you had. The bottom line is you have to make this job doable by mere mortals. And this is why I become a curriculum advocate. It is just too much to expect 3.7 million teachers to do the work of being both curriculum developers and deliverers. So I think there is a role for policymakers to play in terms of identifying solid, again, scientifically sound reading curriculum, and for schools of education to play in terms of ensuring that students do not leave the way I did, unprepared to teach, and being told essentially to to make it up as they go along. I make a rueful joke about this, that if we trained air traffic controllers the way we train teachers, we'd tell them, oh, well, don't worry, everybody crashes the plane first year on the job. Oh, you'll get better. It's just not a way to run our school system. I mean, again, your children are in fourth grade once. They don't have the luxury of a teacher learning on the job. So curriculum can be the organizing thing that it all hangs together. But the bottom line there is again, you have to make this job doable by mere mortals. That's a nuance on what you've written, Congressman. But I think it's an important one, and I'll leave it in there, and then we can discuss it further in the Q&A.
Well, thank you. You really, I think, highlight a tension, at least I felt in writing this, which is to say, as I went down this rabbit hole and talked to Edie Hirsch, and I called Edie Hirsch out of the blue and convinced him to do my now extinct podcast for 2 hours. You can still find that conversation online. Something occurred to me that I hadn't thought about initially, which is, wait, are we saying we need to be much more prescriptive when it comes to curriculum? And that sort of goes against my instincts in some ways. And then you add on to that now. I don't know if you want to comment on that, and this is a good transition to
Joseph. Well, welcome to the tension that's highlighted the last 20 years of my career, Congressman, because you're absolutely right. And look, when I give talks about this, I kind of get rubbed right up against the tension point that you just cited. I don't want to be the guy who says, teach this, don't teach that. But I want teachers to understand, especially teachers who work, as I have, with low-income kids who may not come from the language-rich environments that more affluent and fortunate Americans come from, that they've got high-stakes decisions to make. And if you decide, well, kids don't need to know X, Y, and Z, they need to know A, B, and C instead, well, that may feel like a good decision to make in the moment, but there could be consequences. In other words, I want every teacher in America to understand what Hirsch has taught me, as it were, that knowledge is language, and that there is this kind of generally understood array of what I'll call mental furniture that literate people have. And when you're missing a few pieces of it, well, then that may land to the outside world, and somehow you're less than educated, you're less than prepared, you're less than bright. So I don't want to be the guy who imposes the curriculum. If you ask me for one, I'll give you one. But I absolutely think it's important that we understand that you can't divorce the idea of reading comprehension from, this is the Hirsch insight, from science and social studies and art and music. It's all grist for the mill. So you can't say what I heard when I was a teacher, that, oh, that history and science, that's important, but we'll get to it later after the kids learn how to read. It is learning how to read. They are not, they're not two different entities. They're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. Well, Joseph, so not only do we have this problem, this tension, well, now you have people like me saying, okay, it's great that, kids are going to college, they're reading the great books, and, they're meandering through Foucault and this and that, but the rubber meets the road in terms of their ability to get a job in the modern economy. So how do we work workforce and employability issues into this curriculum debate?
Well, I think you're right about that, Congressman. The road ends at an on-ramp to a career and to capacity to make a household sustaining income, because we know that household formation is collinear with all sorts of good outcomes, not universally, but in terms of the next generation success, avoiding social pathologies and things like that. So right now, the education system essentially, certainly K-12 system, gets the kid as far as getting their diploma and essentially drops them off at the curb to go find something to do. And we don't do a lot in terms of thinking about the types of teaching that Robert's talking about that will equip those kids with native skills to qualify for jobs that fit that economic description I gave. Let me give you a couple of examples. If you look at the 70 million or so Americans that have a high school degree or less, only about 30% of those 70 million can read at a sufficient level to qualify for a middle skills job. So they may have a diploma, they may not, but per one of the key points in your paper, if they are not able to read, and per Robert's point, reading in context, they are fundamentally disabled from jobs that cannot be explained basically by observation. So you can figure out how to work in a quick service restaurant or even as a retail clerk by being told by your supervisor what to do and asking your coworkers what to do, but you can't learn to be a HVAC tech unless you can read a manual and understand what it says. And increasingly, you can't be an HVAC tech unless you can interact with a digital device, which allows you to access records about the actual machine you're working on and the model and repair techniques and whatnot. So reading comprehension and problem solving, where we've been going down consistently relative to other countries in PIAC scores, is something we don't feature sufficiently in a lot of our education system. A second, if you talk to employers about why do students with a high school diploma or an associate's degree, why do they fail in a job they actually get? They disproportionately talk about what are called soft skills, not hard skills. So what's the difference between those two? Soft skills are things like attention to detail, punctuality, the capacity to interact with strangers to you successfully, written and oral spontaneous communication. So a lot of those same people that can't read at the relevant level in context can't compose an email to their supervisor explaining that what happened, let's say with a customer or vendor, in a way that the reader knows what actually happens. Similarly, they can't articulate it, and we all are somewhat nervous about talking groups, particularly groups of strangers that have a capacity to judge us. But now let's go back to school for a second. We design curriculum in the schools, even in technical schools, really around hard skills. You know, we want someone how to do an equation in one unknown. We don't feature in our curriculum things like every student in every class is going to have to write 150 words spontaneously every week, period. Every student in every class once a week is going to have to enter into a sustained verbal explanation of what we're studying about in class. Those things are learned through repetition. And also, we don't stress we're going to have lots of project learning where groups of students are going to work together on something, but I'm mixing the groups as the instructor. I'm not going to let the basketball players do what the basketball players. I'm not going to let the smart kids all huddle together. I'm going to purposely put together groups on a weekly basis of kids I've never seen talking to each other coming into my classroom or going out, because that's how they're going to learn to interact in problem solving with people that they're not immediately comfortable with. So we don't think about teaching to equip people with those soft skills. We think about how to get hard skills. Now, there's a little bit of a data issue here, which is just that it's much easier for an employer to validate hard skills. You either have the certificate or you don't. You either could reboot the frozen computer as an IT help desk job candidate, or you can't. But I'm not, as an employer, going to have a great opportunity to witness you in your professional skills capacity the limited amount of time I have to assess your candidacy. That's why you see a lot of jobs start upping the academic attainment requirements for candidates. I've got some new research coming out this fall that kind of demonstrates that they're using higher level academic attainment, whether it's an associate's degree or particularly a bachelor's degree. That candidate probably has pretty good soft skills. They probably write decently, speak differently. They've got some self-efficacy. They understand you have to show up for class and show up for your exam and show up with your labs and remember your stuff and whatnot. The final thing I want to say is that, and this once again features in your paper, which I enjoyed reading very much, whether it's creating things like apprenticeship accounts or really bolstering technical colleges over time, and for lots of reasons, I'm sure Robert or Rick would have good insight in this, we kind of criminalized vocational education in the United States. Now, we did it in part because some districts used it for tracking and for segregation purposes, and that's not something we would ever tolerate or want to tolerate. But when we know that things like finishing high school is highly correlated with answering one of the fundamental questions that teenagers have been asking themselves since Cain and Abel, which is, what the heck am I doing here? What is this about? Why do I need to do this? I didn't enjoy Moby Dick. That's maybe just me, but you know but I have no doubt about what I was doing in high school. If you can get kids that are not going to be tracking kind of by their academic attainment, background, interests toward the traditional celebrated path that less than 20% of our kids follow, which is, I'm going to go from high school to a 4-year program, which I'm going to complete. That's a minority of kids. Yeah. Only about 40% of kids will ever get some type of 4-year degree. And that number is, really closer to 35, 33 historically. Getting kids familiar with professions, pursuing things they're interested in, ideally with a paid work-based learning environment. That is the gold standard. When you can get, and I'm not talking about 24-year-olds who are becoming journeyman electricians, I'm talking about 16-year-olds. If you can get a 16-year-old in an opportunity to work, and not as a grocery bagger necessarily at the Kroger store, but rather they're part of a program in school where they are serving in some kind of apprentice type role. Look at all the good things that happen. They're showing up in an employer and they're a kid. The employer doesn't think they're going to know what they're doing. The employer is prepared for the fact that 16-year-old or 17 is going to walk in. So when the kid is late the second day or wears a baggy hoodie in a place where there are machines that'll grab your baggy hoodie and shred you can correct them. You expect to have to do that. You don't expect them to show up and be a fully functioning adult, which is what leads to that soft skills turnover problem for the 23-year-old. You're also answering the question of why am I here? And you're letting the kid get familiar in learning environments that aren't academic. And doing important contextual learning, but making that transition from a more closeted classroom to work. So you touched on things with Rick, which are absolutely essential. Things like we have to find ways to get more liquidity in the system so kids can choose something other than a 4-year degree. There are lots. Title IV of the Higher Education Act is based on a first-class understanding of post-secondary education in the United States in 1964. The definition of what's an online course is from the 1998 reauthorization. So, but really getting into Title IV, that you doesn't have to be 100 hours. It doesn't have to be 50% of the content provided by the affiliated institution. That it can be that we can have some type of lifelong Pell access. All of what that does is infuse liquidity into a system to allow people to put some cash against learning requirements, as opposed to either go into post-secondary as traditionally defined or figure out some way to do it for themselves. In any case, I'm going to stop there, but I was impressed with the paper, and I think the relative to that ambition of the road ending at an on-ramp, a pathway to decent job, there are a lot of important things you're advocating that are significantly correlated with that outcome, which is what this should all be about.
Well, thank you. Will Flanders, I have an easy question for you. 30 years ago, Wisconsin started the school choice movement with the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. What is the state of education in Wisconsin today?
A little bit of a broad question there.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Congressman. So I think, there's a lot of different ways to slice this question, but I think, as was discussed in the first panel, I mean, I think there's some ways that we are sort of lagging behind at this point, a lot of which is addressed in your paper that was very nice to read. So we have proficiency rates that are relatively low. We have proficiency rates on the forward exam that are below 50%, across the state. Even in districts that ostensibly are doing a relatively good job, our proficiency rates often don't approach that 50% threshold. But the real problems in some of our really rural districts and in larger cities like Milwaukee. As was mentioned in the first panel, in some school district or some schools in Milwaukee are rated as proficient on the forward exam, are rated as proficient by DPI, but have proficiency rates in reading that are less than 10%. And that's a staggering number, right? We have proficiency rates less than 10%, yet somehow, according to the state standard, these schools are meeting expectations. Now, there are some good reasons behind that. We rate growth highly, and it is important to include growth. So the idea that students are starting way behind, and we're rewarding schools more for helping kids catch up. But ultimately, there needs to be some progress. There needs to be a point where we say, growth and not achieving 10% proficiency is insufficient, and we need to be holding schools to a higher standard. The good news is, with our school choice programs in the state, we do have some evidence that these can be effective. And as was discussed in the first panel, we don't want to say that these are the end-all be-all solution. We need to be incorporating some of what's found in these choice schools into our other mechanisms of education that are still used by the vast majority of students in the state. But what we've done over the past few years is we've done what's known as the apples to apples report. We've done this annually with the data on the forward exam. And the idea there is that in previous years, before Will started doing this report, the Journal Sentinel would come out inevitably every year and say, look, proficiency rates in the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program are low compared to the statewide averages, with no sort of controls or no accounting for any of the variables that affect student proficiency. What we've done with that report over time is sort of control for those factors and look at kids where they are, make apples to apples comparisons of kids over time. And what we see every year that we've done the report, that we had the data, obviously in the pandemic, we no longer have this data, choice and charter students continually perform better than their public school counterparts. They continually have higher scores on the forward exam. And it's not just in these outcomes in terms of test scores that we see better performance for our choice and charter kids. There's been some good research by scholars from the University of Arkansas over the past few years. Corey DeAngelis, many of you folks may be familiar with his work. What they've found is that students who attend choice schools in Milwaukee have better life outcomes. So we have some of our friends from AEI here. The AEI obviously works on the success sequence. If you go through these step-by-step processes in life, that you graduate high school, that you get married and find a stable job, that you're more likely over the long term to have a successful outcome in life. Go through these step-by-step processes. What we know from that research from the University of Arkansas is that our choice and charter schools actually are better at helping kids to get along that road. Kids that attend these schools are less likely to become involved in criminal activity, particularly in a place like Milwaukee. That's a very meaningful and important aspect. And they're more likely to achieve things in life and find a job, less likely to become involved in sort of some of these moral issues like paternity lawsuits and things like that as well, that are just sort of indicators that students aren't necessarily following the proper path in life. So there's a lot of different ways that students can, that schools can approach this, and I think Shannon will talk about some of the innovative techniques in a particular school. But what we know is that overall, when students attend these schools, they are doing better. Now, there are still ways that we can improve our choice and charter sector. There's still limitations on the program that are pretty important to consider. A couple of them are the enrollment caps. So what we have is the school subject to the extent they're choice students in the school, only a certain percentage of students in the school district are able to enroll into a choice school. The good news is that those caps are increasing every year. They go up by 1% of the district enrollment every year, and eventually in 3 or 4 years, they'll be off. But that does limit the ability of schools to focus on students for choice outside of Milwaukee, because you really can't found a school like we have in Milwaukee primarily to serve choice kids, because you're limited in the number of kids that can enroll. The other limitation is the income cap. So we have in Milwaukee a 300% income limit on the choice program. Outside of Milwaukee and our other choice programs, that's 220%. Good news is, the state legislature worked and did increase that income limit from 180% to 220%. But the idea is that if we want choice to apply more broadly, if we want more folks to be able to take advantage of it, then we need to think about, possibly eliminating those caps, or at least let's create equality with Milwaukee, where students throughout the state can take advantage of those programs equally across the board. More broadly, the congressman in your report, you discussed, funding students equally. We do have big disparities between our choice and charter schools and our public schools in the state. One point we always like to bring up is that the lowest funded public school district in Wisconsin is funded higher than any choice and charter school. And that's with state and local money. We don't even get into considering the federal money. That's a more complicated process. But there's no choice and charter school that has equal funding. And they do more with the money they have. That's what we know from our Apples to Apples report. That's what we know from sort of looking at the bang for the buck for each taxpayer dollar that's spent. So one thing we'd like to see, and one thing that's suggested there that I think is a great idea, is to work towards equalizing funding. Make sure that no matter what school door a student enters, they're funded the same amount. It's fundamentally unfair that a student who attends this school is funded less than the student who attends the public school down the road. And I think working towards that goal, even in incremental steps, would be extremely useful. Now, the other thing is, if we create that equalization of funding, I think the backpack funding idea that you bring up is much more viable, is much more possible. Again, that would have let us sort of break up the funding so that it's not necessarily going to all be spent in one school, but maybe you supplement that with some education from online source or from other areas of opportunity. And for rural areas, that's particularly useful. As you mentioned in the previous session, for our most rural districts, there's not necessarily access to 10 or 20 schools, in a close by range like you might find in Milwaukee. But the ability to supplement that and create something like an education savings account really is the wave of the future in education, and something that we need to approach as we think about how to improve school choice in Wisconsin.
Arizona's trying to experiment with that, if memory serves, and so they should have some useful data. Shannon, you're living these issues every single day. I just talk a little bit about some of the innovative approaches that you've seen and led at Milwaukee Lutheran and Free Enterprise Academy.
Sure, thank you, Congressman. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. I guess I should start out by giving you a little bit of a recent history of what is going on in Milwaukee Lutheran, so you understand better what we're trying to accomplish with my Free Enterprise Academy. Maybe about 8 or 9 years ago, Milwaukee Lutheran decided to answer a call to begin to serve and educate students in Milwaukee's inner city. So as of right now, our student body of maybe 850 students, 97% are inner city economically disadvantaged Black kids. And so obviously a population that needs quite a bit of help. And so a couple years after that, the CEO of our Lutheran High School Association, Cole Brown, was at graduation at Milwaukee Lutheran, handing out diplomas, shaking hands, but he was also asking the students what their plans were after they graduated. And he became a little dismayed at how many students really had no plan or no semblance of one. And so out of that was born something called the Red Knight Institute. Because we're not a diploma mill, what we wanted to do is we wanted to give these kids a more practical, customized learning experience while they're at the school. And so what the Red Knight Institute is a group of 5 in-house academies that are designed to more customize the learning experience at the school. You have an art academy, which teaches marketable skills in art, like graphic design, that sort of thing. Lutheran Printing Services is a student-run business out of Milwaukee Lutheran. Great prices, so if anybody needs a banner. You have an Urban Education Academy. Those students will make a commitment to come back and teach in an urban environment, and they can earn scholarships to college based upon that commitment. You have an Honors Academy, which is exactly as it sounds. These are the kids that are 3.5 or better, AP courses, all that. They're going to go on to college and they're going to do great things. But we also understand that college is not for everyone. And so we have what's called a Career Academy, which is actually our largest academy, and that teaches trade skills. And so my academy, the Free Enterprise Academy, is sort of the last piece of that jigsaw puzzle. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to take the concepts of free enterprise, free markets, financial discipline, financial literacy, entrepreneurship, take those concepts and incorporate them into the existing curriculum, and then create new courses and programming around those concepts. So how do we do that? The first is obviously in the first 2 years of a student's education at Milwaukee Lutheran, they're having to deal with a lot of prerequisites. They're not getting a lot of electives. So what we will do is we will have free enterprise units put into some of the courses that every Milwaukee Lutheran student has to take. For example, civics or American history, African American history. We've got talking with one of the history teachers now where we're going to talk about incorporating an entrepreneurship unit into African American history using the Bronzeville district of Milwaukee as an example before that neighborhood kind of went away, where you had Black businesses, you had, Black artists and that sort of thing. And there was really a thriving community at the time. Well, how did they make that work? And so every student at Milwaukee Lutheran is at least getting some of this training. And then at the end of their sophomore year, which is the time to declare for an academy, you can declare for one academy, you can declare for all 5, you can declare for none at all, whatever you think that you can handle. Then we will start to steer the course selection into that area. So with Free Enterprise Academy, those students will start taking economics, they'll start taking accounting, and they'll start going into some of the other courses that I've created, like business communications, or my business success course, which is an entrepreneurial based course where students actually learn how to, they're building a business. We will try and bring in our partners in the Milwaukee business community to come in and talk to the kids. There are a lot of Black businesses that are out there. They really want to share their knowledge. Other businesses, we've got people coming in from all over the place who want to be a part of this experience and want to connect with these kids. One of the things that we do, we were talking about some of these soft skills. One of the things that we do in my business success course is we've been very fortunate. We found donors every year for this. But we will take every student and we will outfit them with a signature professional outfit. So at the end of the year, a suit, tie, shirt, shoes for the boys, pantsuit or whatever is appropriate for the girls. So, it makes the point that how you present yourself in an interview or at graduation or at networking events, these things matter. And so, obviously a suit is not going to last an 18-year-old boy for, very long, but we're trying to make the point that, this is part and parcel of how you make yourself successful, how you build wealth, ultimately how you're going to increase your standing in life and create a legacy for your neighborhood and the other people around you. So I'm not a teacher. I'm not going to steal that title from somebody else. I'm an attorney. I spent 23 years as a litigator in some form or fashion here in Southeast Wisconsin. This is Northeast Wisconsin. But anyway, I spent the bulk of my career as a commercial litigator with a business law firm on Milwaukee's east side. So that's where I started to, gain my knowledge and to understand the importance of, building businesses, having financial knowledge, financial discipline, financial literacy, especially in these areas where, free enterprise, capitalism, these sort of things are seen. They're not either taken very seriously or they're seen as a pejorative in some, senses. They're seen as a negative. And so my vision, what I want to do is I want to have these kids come in educated in the benefits and the advantages of using the capitalist, the free enterprise system to their advantage. I would love for a couple of them to go out, spend 7 to 10 years perfecting their craft, and then go out on their own, start a business, hopefully within their neighborhood, hire from within the neighborhood and create prosperity from the inside out, which in my opinion is the only way you're going to get any sort of sense of order, justice, peace in any of these neighborhoods. So that's ultimately the vision that we're trying to put in to all of our academies at Milwaukee Lutheran High School, but especially with the Free Enterprise Academy. And so we were very fortunate, again, I was an attorney. I wasn't even in at the beginning part of this process. A gentleman by the name of Bill Nasgovitz, who is the board chair, creator all around grand poobah of Heartland Advisors down on the east side. I think they manage about $1.5 billion in assets every year. He's a value investor, and he's been all over the world, therefore, and he's seen poverty in a lot of areas. And he said, I want to really teach people how to use free enterprise in order to raise themselves out of poverty so they don't need government programs which aren't going to work anyway. So how do we do this? And so he didn't want to start at the college level because by that time it could be too late, right? I mean, almost, what is it, 60% of college freshmen can't pass a basic financial literacy exam. So he wanted to start at the high school level, and Bill is a Milwaukee Lutheran graduate. And so that's how we kind of got in on the ground floor of all of this. At the time, I was actually doing some volunteer work for Will. I was writing columns on, how do we solve our inner city violence problems? How do we create prosperity in the inner cities? And this program came along at about that time. And so through some connections, we were able to make this marriage. But this is what we've got going on at Milwaukee Lutheran High School. And so it's how do we do this in a manner that is different than what you're typically going to see in an MPS? We talked about not only with soft skills, but also changing the culture that these kids, the environment that these kids are learning in. What we try to do is we try to tell them every day that they are loved, that because they are loved, we have high expectations for them, and we expect that their outcomes are going to be higher, and we are going to give them an advantage if they stay with us and they listen to what it is that we're trying to impart upon them. Our vice principal, at the end of the day, with announcements over the PA system, he always ends with, "I love you. More importantly, he loves you." That's not something that you're going to see at a lot of other schools, especially in our public schools. The first book that any Milwaukee Lutheran student gets when they walk in the door is the Bible. Okay. And so, you can tell from right off the bat, our approach is much different than you're going to get in a lot of other places. I have, again, I'm a lawyer. I'm completely untethered at this point, so I can just come in and I can say what's on my mind. I can say, I can tell these kids how things are working, how the real world really works, how they can use these tools in order to build a life for themselves, for their families, for their neighborhoods, and create that legacy. It really has been a gratifying experience, but these are some of the tools that we are using in order to fight back that tide rather than, using a tennis racket, but to show these kids that it is in their hands, that they can be successful despite what's being told out to them outside of these walls, that they can achieve, and that they can come back and hopefully come back and teach the next generation.
That's great. So I'm going to call a little bit of an audible that will make Libby and Kyle nervous momentarily. I'm supposed to ask questions for the next half hour, and then we have 15 minutes for audience questions. But given that we have so many experts, not just on the panel, but in the audience that are also practitioners, I'd rather just move directly to opening up to the audience, and I'll guide it. And I'll just reserve maybe 5 minutes on the end to ask a question that has been looming in my mind since I started this. So why don't we do that? Because you're far more interesting than I am. Gus.
Thank you. I'm Gus Ramirez, and I've been sort of involved in transforming education for over 30 years. The most recent project is St. Augustine Preparatory Academy, which now is 1,500 students and will be about 2,500 students in 5 years. This school has demonstrated we can change fundamental outcomes. Elementary school students are from K4 to 5th grade are progressing at 30% faster than the national rate. 6 through 12 is twice the national rate. Our first class improved their ACT scores by 5.6 points in 2.5 years, which is unheard of. So the key is you can take these minority kids, and we're 98% minority kids, provide them great teachers, great facilities, and they will perform. So what is the barrier to achieving this more globally? both in Milwaukee and throughout the state. And I want to give you some solutions. And I don't think we ought to be thinking 2030. We got to be thinking no later than 2025. There are things we can do today in the next several years to fundamentally change outcomes, and I'll tell you what they are. Number one, well referred to, and it's in your paper as well, is funding. The impediment to growth of great schools in Milwaukee is the gap. And what the gap is how much good schools spend on students versus what they get through the choice or charter program. That's roughly $2,000 or $3,000 per child. So if you look at Aug Prep with 2,500 kids, we're going to be having to raise $5 to $6 million each year to fund the gap. That's the impediment to growth, because if you're spending $5 or $6 million a year in a gap, you can't spend that to have additional facilities. So getting equal funding is probably the number one thing you can do to change outcomes. And what are we trying to change? What we're trying to change, let me step back. Having tried to transform public education, about 10 years ago, Ricardo Diaz, Henry Tyson, Tim Sheehy, and I got together and realized that that doesn't work. Okay, I haven't met a political leader yet that is willing to take on the challenge of transforming public education, because of the unions, because of the politics, because of parents who don't understand. There's a whole lot of reason, because it's an employment base for African Americans in particular. NPS is the largest employer of minorities, I think, in the state. So there are a lot of issues that make it extremely difficult to transform public education. But what you can do is change market share. And what's happened in this choice program is we've gone from 5% to 45% or so. So that is a fundamental change. Now, not all choice schools and all charter schools are great schools, and I'll deal with that in a few minutes. But the point is, if you want to change fundamental outcomes, you got to change it through market share. And if we do that, we'll eventually put enough pressure on the public school system that they actually have to do some transformation, or they'll cease to exist. And to me, that is a strategy we have to pursue, and the funding element is the key impediment. The second, which is completely different, is we got to fund fully K3 and K4. We got to get these kids in school early. Our first superintendent was Alfonso Carmona. He had a 4-year-old in kindergarten, and we started with K4 to 3, and then 6th grade and 9th grade. But at any rate, he came after about a month. He came to me and said, "Gus, you won't believe it. I expected high school students and middle school students to be 2 or 3 years behind. So these K4 students are 2 years behind." So we have to address that as early as we can. And K3 education and K4 being fully funded so that it's broader throughout the state will have a fundamental impact. The third thing is something that choice, charter, and public schools hate and don't want to have, which is accountability. Funding should follow performance. We have schools near Henry Tyson, St. Marcus, that have 0 kids proficient in math or verbal skills. 0 out of 400 kids, not one is proficient. And yet we keep on funding those schools ad infinitum. There has to be some accountability. We have some choice schools that are not good schools. People got in for the wrong reasons. Jim Bender, and he's here someplace, and I have had some difficult conversations because he doesn't want accountability to limit the growth of choice schools. Accountability is extremely important, and it's something that we need to establish. Okay? And the fourth point is facilities. As the market share has changed, particularly in Milwaukee, we have a bunch of excess facilities. Now, MPS tends to use them at a very low level of occupancy to prevent them from being declared excess. But we have to have these excess facilities become available to choice and charter so that they don't have to spend $100 million building a school for 2,500 kids. And that's really important. And those 4 things are things that can be done now. They don't have to wait. And, I have 2 businesses. One is Husco International, a very successful multinational corporation. And our biggest challenge, longer term, is not getting college kids or engineers, but it's filling our factories. Now, we automate the heck out of everything, so we don't need as many employees. But we can get far better talent in our factories in China and in India than we can in the United States. More educated, more capable, more productive.
That's a stunning statement.
And that's a sad testament. And the only solution to this is education. If you look at southeastern Wisconsin, the only generator of human resources over the next 10 years is going to be the south side of Milwaukee with the Hispanic population. And what we have is we're fortunate to have some excellent schools. Carmen, UCC, Cristo Rey, St. Augustine, St. Anthony's at the elementary level, and some Catholic schools that are getting better. So we're the Mecca. And it's great that we have this, but we have to have this expansion of good schools to the north side so that we have better high schools for the African-American community kids to attend. And there's no way that's going to happen unless the funding mechanisms are changed. So I think, and I encourage you to have a shorter time frame for getting things done. 2030 is just too long. Another thing is know that reforming public schools, unless you have a leader that's willing to change completely the governance of public schools, is impossible.
Well, maybe we can use that as a jumping off point for a little bit of a debate. I'm disturbed at the level of consensus between you and Will on this concept. What I call fair student funding makes sense to me. I can see that the devil is in the details. I'd be curious if there's any panelists first that wants to push back on that basic idea. And if there is no panelist, I'd invite maybe anyone in the audience who has a different view. Eric, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you know there's a diversity of views. Has anyone seen states attempt to implement a fair student funding model and they've discovered that it's not as easy as you might think when you write it out on a piece of paper? Anybody?
I mean, I can just say I think that it absolutely is a difficult challenge. This is something we've been wrestling with. We just put out a report ourselves where we're sort of looking at how would this be implemented in Wisconsin, and there's constitutional issues. There's other issues as well. The biggest impediment is the property tax funding of education in the state. Yeah. We're a relatively property tax dependent state in terms of funding our local schools, and we do have a constitutional mandate that property taxes must fund local schools as well. So these are the things that we wrestle with. In a state that was more funded at the state level, moving to a fair student funding model is easier to implement, where the money follows the kid regardless of the door they go through. I think the equalization of funding, bringing funding up to the same level across the board is easier to implement than sort of the backpack funding. But it is a big challenge, and it's something we're continuing to explore. There are a number of avenues we think are intriguing, but it definitely is something that hasn't been solved as yet.
Sure. Beth.
I spent a little time in Illinois trying to work on adequate and equitable funding across. We don't have school choice in Illinois, but in charter schools. And there are some complexities that you may not think about. Part of it is the percentage of students that choice schools are serving with significant disabilities. Students who are coming out of services that are for kids who have been incarcerated or in juvenile justice centers. The fact that most charter schools do not have the burden of transportation that you have in rural schools. So I do think we want closer funding, and I've spent a lot of time fighting for that. And I think, there are folks like at the Economics Lab at Georgetown who have some really interesting models. But I think when we're having these conversations, we do have to talk about some of the students with more complex needs who are not being educated in charter or choice schools. And we have to think about that funding in a very fair and balanced way.
Can I also address the accountability question?
Please, yes.
So this is obviously a fundamental debate in the choice and charter movement. I think the argument we'd like to make is that over time, and I know Gus, you would probably say it's too slow, but we do see an improvement in the marketplace over time in Milwaukee. So schools like yours that have come online in the past few years take market share away from some of those poor performing schools. We did do a report a few years ago that looked at, are we seeing families move to schools that are better performing by these objective metrics like test scores? And what we found is that yes, in Milwaukee, kids are moving over time to schools that are safer, Safety is obviously a preeminent concern of all families, even above test scores and things like that. And the schools that are growing in Milwaukee are those schools that do perform higher on those standardized tests. So yes, we do have some schools in the region that are poor performing. They persisted, longer than than some folks might have liked. There are other metrics that we can measure schools by other than performance, and they may be meeting the safety needs of those kids better than the local public schools as well. But I do think that the marketplace can work. What we do need to do is make sure we're fostering an environment where there's an opportunity for those schools to grow, and things like outstate removing enrollment caps and removing the raising the income limits can sort of foster an environment where those schools have more opportunities. But it's definitely a fundamental debate that there's obviously disagreement on.
Just to draw Robert in quickly, as we talk about empowering parents via choice, I talked earlier about modernizing DPI to sort of expand choice. Do you think there is a way in which we could convey curriculum to parents in an easily digestible fashion as they make school decisions? Or is that something that at best can be litigated at the school board level, to the extent that's even happening right now? Does that make sense?
I'm smiling because for the last 15 or 20 years, I've been banging the drum saying, boy, what we need in this country is for parents to be as savvy consumers of curriculum and school culture as they are of, say, pediatricians and medicines and whatnot that kids get. And right now we're having a moment where folks are focusing on curriculum like a hawk, and it's not going well. So when the gods want to punish you, they answer your prayers, so to speak. Maybe it's a temporary glitch, but I mean, I actually do think that in a perfect world, and I think it was Will just referred to the fact that a lot of parents are concerned, and rightly so, about safety. So I mean, that's a big driver for schools of choice and charters, and that's not to be dismissed. But it would be better. I mean, I think choice works better, frankly, when we are the finer grain distinctions you make. In other words, I want a world in which parents are saying, no, I want a classical school or a Montessori school or project-based learning school, as opposed to I just want something other than this. That's going to lead to I wrote an entire book about a charter school in New York City, and as I wrote, I walked in expecting to write a book about curriculum, and I walked out having written a book about culture, which surprised me. So parents are going to make decisions for lots of different reasons, but at the end of the day, the more sophisticated those decisions are about curriculum, about culture, about facilities, et cetera, then the stickier choice becomes, and the better the outcome for kids.
It's hard for me, even though I advocate for kind of a color-coded system where the state star rating is displayed in an easily accessible form for parents, it's hard to develop an appropriate metric for culture in schools that makes any sense to parents. So other questions? Sure. Jim, you want to defend yourself? Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jim Bender from School Choice, Wisconsin. Previously mentioned comment before. And yes, Gus and I have had some back and forth, and I've also had some pretty stern back and forth with legislators in this state, particularly a few years ago with Assembly Bill 1, which was an accountability bill. And Gus had made mention that there was a desire on my part to not have accountability to stop growth in the schools. And I would say that's a bit of a misrepresentation of my position. I'm fine with accountability. The question is, accountable to who? And for what, right? So when you have somebody say, that school's not performing well, it should be shut down. What's your measuring stick? Who controls how that happens? And what do you do with the parents once you close that school? If you don't have a plan, you're taking a handful of marbles and throwing them down the street. You don't have a place for those parents to go. As I've been involved in education reform for a decade, I have become far more focused on the role of the parent in the entire process. So when I listen to the reforms, and I read your reforms, and I listen to people talk about education, and I oftentimes hear a very top-down approach. We should make these changes. The we is the legislature. The we is the school board. The we is this other really group of super smart people that will for sure this time make the right decision on behalf of parents, and it'll all work.
Yeah.
Except that never happens. So when I listen to your potential changes, I come back to the same question every time, even in your report. How do the parents understand it? How do they access it?
Yeah.
And then how do they enforce it on the system? Gus is completely right. The way that you have transformed Milwaukee is by empowering parents and building schools like St. Aug Prep. It's really hard to build a school like St. Aug Prep, though, and you can only do so much of it. And funding is key to be able to fund the operations of the school so that innovation can happen in new ways and new programs getting started. If you're spending all your time, raising money for operations, it makes that difficult. But I still come back. So even on the ideas that you have, what's the role of the parent? What's the role of the family? Not just the parent, not just the student. What's the role of the family in education? Because at the end of the day, the family and the parents are the primary educators of the children. If your idea doesn't have a specific role for the parent, it's likely going to fail because they won't understand it, they won't be able to leverage it, and their children won't be able to thrive from it because the parents aren't involved, the family's not involved. For us at School Choice Wisconsin, and we are in front of the legislature proposing ideas, it's not for private schools, it's not for charter schools, it's not for public schools. It's for opportunities for parents and how you're developing policy and how you're able to change the funding mechanism. Will and I are involved in a series of questions with the Fiscal Bureau right now on how do you actually get funding to be mobile. We fund public schools in Wisconsin like we did in the 50s and 60s. We've got yearly student enrollment. We use prior year enrollment, 3-year rolling averages. Everything is slow and monotonous. That's not the way the world works, right? People are moving. Money has to be able to move. But on all your proposals, if there's not a particular role for the parent and the family, I think there's going to be trouble. So that would be my one question to you on your report is, how do you leverage and then the role of the parent?
Yeah. What's that? Oh,
She'll
did you want to
follow
weigh
up,
in?
I
Yeah.
This is the School Choice Wisconsin role
Yeah.
right here. I'm Susan Mitchell, and I've been working on this also for
I
many,
thought you
many-
overachievers would sit in the front.
for many years. And I do take Gus's point about the funding. There's another thing I want to point out, and I want to ask you, you said early on that school choice is necessary but not sufficient. We try to focus here on what's necessary, and we think more of it's necessary. And that will improve the results that Will noted and other positive results. I think one thing that is not well known about the school choice programs in Wisconsin is how heavily regulated they are. It's just a very, very big weight that affects the schools, that affects the parents trying to get into them. And one of the things that would be really beneficial to do as quickly as possible is to take a look at those statutes and peel away all this stuff where DPI, if you talk to school administrators, what DPI and parents will tell you is, or the administrators and parents will tell you, DPI is trying to catch us doing something wrong. And the degree of regulation that has built up over the 30, 20 years of the program, despite best efforts to tamp it back, raises questions like, is there some form of regulatory bypass here? Your report correctly gets at the DPI problems. We've tried to elect people, we've tried to negotiate with DPI, we've tried to threaten them legislatively with the help of, we've sued them and all those things. It's a very intractable problem. And if we don't get at it, it really limits and impedes the power of the idea. We've not, I don't think in this country, given school choice an actual fair shake. We do not have a program anywhere in the country where a parent can sign up for a private school just as easily as they can sign up for a public school, get the same amount of funding following them, and have the same freedom. If we had that, it would be really interesting to see what kind of progress we should make. And I think Wisconsin ought to be going down the road of let's get to that kind of parity and that kind of fairness. And I think trusting the parents is the way you go. There is no government that can impose accountability as well as a parent who can vote with his or her feet and walk away from a school that's not working.
Thank you. Eric, let's go to you. He did. And he's the tallest guy in the room, I think. So.
Thank you. Eric Van den Heuvel, I'm the, amongst other things, the president of the Green Bay School Board. And so as I sit here and listen today, I actually agree with a lot of things that have been said. I think accountability is important. I think parent involvement is incredibly important. And I'm not opposed to school choice. I think there's lots of different ways to solve the problem. Two things that I want to think about, though, is what, the concept of all kids. So what do we do with a kid whose parents aren't involved, whose parents are incarcerated, whose parents move around, who aren't engaged in that kid's life? If I'm being judged, if I'm being held accountable, and I can pick which kids come to my school and turn other kids away, I'm going to probably not take that kid whose parents don't bring them to parent-teacher conferences. Or if I'm if I'm a student with a severe disability, EBD, we have to train our teachers, and maybe we do in other places too. What do you do if a kid hits you? What do you do when the kid bolts out the door? What's the plan to chase after them? If I'm a school that says I don't have to keep that kid in my school anymore, I'm probably not going to, because it's going to be really hard for me to achieve the outcomes. So I just want to make sure that we're considering. I'm not opposed to accountability. Certainly the metrics that we use are different. And we've talked a little bit about growth versus proficiency. And I agree that 10%, in some public schools isn't good enough. That's not going to get us to where we need to go. I just want to make sure that we're thinking about all kids, because there are kids in our communities that don't have an advocate, that don't have someone who's going to say, I'm going to research the best school and I want to take you someplace else. Because I'm not opposed to that. And you're right, there are schools all over the place that aren't good. And we should address that. And good is a loose term, but I want to make sure that we're advocating for those kids who don't have anyone else advocating for them. Because what public education can do is it's there for all kids. And if you have that kid who bolts out the door or who hits their teacher, we're still going to keep working with them. And maybe we don't achieve the outcomes with that kid, but we're still there. We're not giving up on them. We're not telling them they don't belong here anymore. And so we need to make sure that we have a system. And if we're judging a school that has a bunch of kids like that and say, well, that school is failing, we value what we can measure. And we talked about culture and things. So if we have kids with those types of challenges and we're overcoming those challenges, but we don't perform well on test scores, or they're not reading at the same level, it doesn't mean the school is failing. They're overcoming other challenges that other schools don't have to overcome. And so don't disagree with many of the things that were said in the room, but we also have to know that there's kids in our system, in our communities, in our cities, who don't have those structures and systems in place, who don't have parents who are going to help them take advantage of those things. So just something to think about.
Absolutely.
Can I weigh in on that?
Yeah, Robert, please.
Yeah, no, I was just going to compliment the Green Bay superintendent for that and commit an act of heresy here. My ed reform credentials are in good order, but what you just described was one of the takeaways of the book I alluded to that I wrote a couple of years ago, which I spent a year looking at the highest performing charter school network in New York City. And having been an inner city school teacher in the public system, this was one of the conclusions that I wrote about. I said, look, it is a kind of a narrative has grown up around choice and charters that says, look, the only difference is the door that the kid walks in the morning. They walk in this door, it's a good outcome. They walk in that door, and it's a bad outcome. And we produce studies that show, that charter schools, for example, create a rising tide that lifts all boats. Look, I'm a choice guy, I'm a charter guy, but what you're saying is a very real thing. And I don't have a solution other than to acknowledge it. At least let's start with that. One of the things that made this charter school in New York City so well performing is tons of parental support, tons of parental buy-in. This was a school that was directly across the street from where I was a student teacher in the same district. And having spent a year monitoring one and 5 years teaching in the other, there's just no doubt in my mind that they are just not comparable. But you have to have both, right? You can't hold one accountable to the standards of the other. But let's not take it in the other direction as well. Let's not take high potential kids who are black and brown, and and say, well, no, you must stay in this school because because it's fair, because that's what equity demands. Nobody makes that demand of me about my kid, for example. So, all of this, I don't have an answer for you, but this starts with a really clear-eyed assessment of exactly the conditions that you just described.
Thank you. I know there's a hand back. Sir.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Hughes, and I have the privilege to work with Beth Purvis at a national foundation. My background, though, is K-12 public education and private school management organizations. So I've been able to work cross-sector, and I was a superintendent for 16 years, sat on the Blue Commission, or the Blue Ribbon Commission on School Finance, thought a lot about all this stuff. Here's the thing, I think you have to look at it from a statewide perspective. And you got to get out of the sector wars. And I think you really have to dig down and build around parents. What Gus Ramirez is saying is exactly right. You can do those things really quickly, but we can get lost in all of the politics. There is an opportunity right now where a lot of parents have, across all income levels, have seen for the first time what their kids' education looks like. Your reading literacy piece, somewhere along the way in the last 7 to 10 years, a line's been crossed, and I'm going to say it, in public schools especially, around reading and literacy, and parents are realizing their kids are not getting the education that even my kids got 25 years ago. And so this needs to be done parent by parent, district by district, board by board, community by community. And you've got this opportunity right now. All of the dissent, all of the ferment, Rick, all the issues in MT right now, and Kim, those are actually opportunities. And those are actually, more than anything, parents realizing that the education they thought they were getting in their community is not what they're getting and what they've been paying for, why they've moved there. You're spot on about the need for advocating where parents don't advocate, but I think you've got to start moving quick, and it's parent by parent, district by district, community by community.
Thank you. So I think we have about 10 minutes left. The gloves have finally come off. Everyone was too afraid to criticize my report on the first panel, but now we're getting into it. I like this. This was my only goal. So let's make good use of the time that remains. Sir.
I got a legislative tag team with Representative Murphy here.
Yeah.
I raised my hand higher than him.
Yeah.
He was actually first, so I'm going to give him the microphone as long as I can get it back.
Well, that's very,
you're giving that to Murphy. You may never get it back.
Very, very.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about school accountability, and I think this is an important issue because when I talk about turning our private schools into quasi-public schools, this is exactly where it starts. Jim Bender brought up AB1. I was on the education committee when that bill came up, and I was one of, I think, 2 Republicans that voted against allowing that bill to come out of committee. Now, AB1 is an AB1 for no reason. It's expected to pass. So that bill was killed, even though it was expected to go forward. Now, we look at our private schools. They've always been accountable. But who have they been accountable to? They're accountable to students and they're accountable to parents. Now we want to make them accountable to government. Is this what's going to, they've been excellent in the past. Is making them accountable to government now going to make them better? I don't think so. I don't think that's where we want to go. And so, for instance, we get about $1,000 per student in the state of Wisconsin from the federal government. What does the federal government provide for that $1,000? I think many times we'd be better off if we let them keep their $1,000 and we didn't have to deal with the regulations that come from them. But that's just my feeling. You know, earlier, Mike, you talked about leadership from Washington on education. To me, if your leadership was to be the Pied Piper that was going to lead the education rats out of Washington, that's the leadership that I would like.
Just following up on Dave's point, and then I've got kind of a little bit different direction to go. I just met Gus before, so I'd be excited to have more conversations with him. But in my experience in dealing with school choice, and I think everybody understands when I say this statement, is that school choice program in the state of Wisconsin is always one legislative cycle away from extinction. Okay? And don't think that they wouldn't try to do it. And so we have to win the battle of public opinion. And one of the strongest arguments that we have is that we do it better for less money. And if we were to lose that, I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't increase money as time goes by, but losing that strong argument that we have, I think that would be a big loss. And so public opinion is something we need to maintain. Second point, I'd like to go back to the reading question, and I addressed this to Robert, who I see on the screen there right now. I come from a family of teachers. I have 10 brothers and sisters, almost missed the number there. And 7 of them, including myself, are teachers. 2 of my children are teachers, and they recently went through student teaching, and it's private school, but they had to do some student teaching in the public schools. And both of them came back to me in conversations and said when they were doing their public school student teaching, they were just shocked at how much time was spent in the public schools on 2 subjects, reading and math. And I said, well, that's the 2 things that are tested. That's what everybody's looking at. So, they're going to spend more time on that. And they said, well, it's not just that. I mean, they might have social studies once a week, or maybe science twice a week. And I'm kind of looking for a validation of a theory that I have here, which is why I'm turning to you, because I have no statistical evidence of this whatsoever. It's just my own experience, is that if we would actually, in our public schools, use appropriate methodology in teaching, have better teachers, we could actually spend less time on reading and spend more time on reading and on social studies and science and all these other areas, which are part of reading. That's where the context comes from. So I guess I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Robert?
Real simple. I agree. I mean, this is brings me full circle, because this is the reason why I signed up for 2 years in education and spent 20 for exactly this conundrum. The misapprehension that reading is a skill and that you can train or develop it, but like you would riding a bike or throwing a ball. That's a complete misunderstanding of what reading comprehension is. If we really understood reading comprehension for what it is, then ironically, we would probably teach it less. We would probably spend more time. At least once you master the basic decoding and phonics in the early elementary years, then grades third grade up would be less about reading instruction and more about the full, knowledge-rich curriculum I spoke earlier. And that would, ironically enough, for complicated reasons that we don't have time to talk about this afternoon, that would almost certainly lead to reading improvement. This, by the way, is one of the real problems. And Congressman, earlier today, you were describing how you were kind of having a complicated relationship with choice. My words, not yours. That you had the same journey that I had, which is you going from thinking this is the answer to, well, it's more complicated than that. Because choice is only as good as our understanding of things like pedagogy and reading comprehension, etc. Otherwise, it just becomes what I call the second flavor of bad.
Other questions for the panel? Vanessa.
Hi there, I'm Vanessa Moran. I'm the director of the Office of Educational Opportunity, and in that role, I'm privileged to be able to serve as a statewide charter school authorizer. I'm also a school board member in the Howard-Swamico School District, right out here, just outside of Green Bay. So I also work in the traditional public school district as well. So I certainly understand the full breadth of K-12 public education, K-12 charter education, and just allowing, opportunities for students and making sure that we're providing great options. And we've talked a lot today about education in K-12, and I just wanted to ask for your thoughts specifically on the connection between K-12 and higher ed. So I'm just interested in how we create stronger relationships between K-12, higher ed, our technical college systems, and our four-year universities, and what this panel has to say about that.
That's great. Maybe we'll go to Joseph first. My quick answer is what I hear just talking to technical colleges, our 4 years, is that they're having to remediate basic skills they thought were covered in K through 12. And so there clearly is a disconnect. And then if you're spending a year having to go back and do things you thought were covered in high school math or English, well, then obviously you're not getting the full benefit of a college education. So I'll just preface it with that comment, and then Joseph will go to you first, and then other panelists can weigh in.
Well, just quickly, Congressman, one thing you see consistently in the community college data is more and more kids are either arcing into a general ed program in the belief that they will then matriculate to a four-year institution, but less than 20% of them ever do. And in the meantime, they're taking pre-college type courses that are not career and technical education. So they're burning through valuable time and lending or grant, Pell Grant type resources in pursuing something that's not going to help them get employed. And also many, they're using program hours, credits to do that remediation in things like basic math, basic literacy. The thing that I think systemically we have to accept is that, and you had someone, I couldn't catch their name, who's an employer, saying, we can't get people who want to work in our factory. And we don't have, less and less do we have post-secondary credentials that arc directly into employment. They are getting indirect, just like a four-year credential is. In addition to that, there's just something we have to stipulate, which is the speed of requirements change for work is so greatly outstrips the capacity of the education system to respond that we're getting a real separation. So if you look, I'll have a paper on this a little later this year, but the average job is churning its skills requirements at the rate of 1/3 a year. So how's an educator supposed to figure out, study the market, figure out what skills are required, embed that in curriculum when the skills requirements are churning at that rate? If you canvass US job descriptions for retail clerks, 800 separate skills are mentioned somewhere. And the typical job description demands 30 for a retail clerk. So we're getting to a point now where the skills development system, particularly our technical and community colleges, are just being outstripped, and we have to fundamentally rethink how to build some new connections from the employer back. I think some employers are starting to recognize that, and we see some innovations in that space. But there's a disconnect from higher ed and employment, let alone disconnect between higher ed and K through 12.
Thank you. Well, one more, and then, well, we'll do two more, and then I'll be brief in my final question, comment back there, and then we'll go to Brittany after that.
Quick point. I move around the state and talk to a lot of groups, see a lot of local officials a fair bit. And when I see school board members, they talk about, and you were referring to it before, and Gus, the default switch is, default setting is really strong. And I touch school board members who look out at their audience chairs, and they've been looking at the same pile of dust for 20 years on those chairs. And the fact is, part of the reason we're here, whether we like to admit it or not, is there has been massive economic and educational disruption. That's just a fact. And part of it has been, I was thinking about it when you were asking the question as well, that status quo setting is so strong, it's scary. And you know what? There's a high percentage of parents and families out there right now where if the pandemic went away tomorrow, they'd be just fine. They want their life back. That's just a fact. They want their life back, which begs the question to me, do kind of the challenges and everything that's happened has been created by the disruption to education. I think it provides a huge opportunity for change. I also think that I worry that the moment has passed us by already. And so that's my question is, and I think about it in terms of people going, we got to get what Gus was saying about 2025. we got to move. I mean, that's what my worry is. We got to get moving.
I don't think it's passed us by. I choose to be an optimist. It's always darkest before it gets pitch black, Brian. So, but I do. I mean, I just would tell you in my, what I think is a statistically significant sample size of parents in Northeast Wisconsin. I mean, people are calling about these issues in a way I've never experienced in the 5 years prior. Now, it's incumbent upon us, primarily at the state and local level, for reasons that Dave Murphy rightly identifies, to turn that into reform. And my only argument about choice is that it has more layers than just how we traditionally think about it, particularly in rural areas. And without some, I think, reforms to regulation and school governance in Wisconsin, we're always going to be hitting up against the limits of what choice can be accomplished. I want to quickly go to Brittany, and then we have a few minutes after that. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, no, you were back there too. I'll be quick. We can fit both in. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll be very fast. One quick comment. I'm a living example. My name's Jamie Tyrell. I have a PhD in educational leadership. I also hold 3 teaching licenses, and I'm currently not qualified to be a principal in the state of Wisconsin. So I have to go back to school at a master's level.
Wow.
Anyway, my question actually has to do with accountability with teacher preparation and in higher education. So prior to my current role, I actually worked in teacher preparation under the UW system. And I found myself becoming very frustrated quickly at the quality of preparation our teachers are receiving from individuals who have very intense research agendas and or tenured faculty who have never stepped foot in a classroom or who have not stepped foot in a classroom for many, many years. And many of our teachers are coming out of those institutions unprepared and not ready to teach children. And so what accountability can we put in place? I heard you mention, the praxis exam, which is a great measure of students' content knowledge, but not the pedagogical knowledge needed to be successful in front of children. So
my quick theory is I think competition produces accountability. And so if you open up non-college of education pathways to becoming a certified teacher or principal, then you sort of get accountability as a byproduct. But anyone else on the panel who's thought about this, I'd open it up to you.
I would just say that states should remember, state education departments should remember, as one state chief told me, that they certify teachers because you allow them to certify teachers. It has always confused me why in the ed reform era we have not really held schools of education accountable for exactly the phenomenon that she describes. They are minting boxcar numbers of teachers who are simply unprepared to teach, and the assumption is, as I mentioned earlier, is well, you're just going to learn that on the job.
Well, my other argument, and all it is an argument, is that DPI doesn't produce accountability, in part because of how we select people to lead DPI. And until you actually can hold governors and other officials and school board officials accountable for educational outcomes, I just think you're going to get more of the status quo. Brittany.
Hi, I'm Brittany Goodger. I'm the Executive Director for Rocketship Public Schools and the Board Chair for Charter School Advocates. And I want to agree 100% with Gus, and thank you, Gus, for your support. It is really, really important for funding in Wisconsin. Rocketship is a national charter organization. We have 5 different areas. The only place that we cannot run off of per pupil is here in Wisconsin. We need to fundraise also. So funding is a huge issue so that we can continue to grow. We have 2 schools. We have one on the north side and south side, and until funding increases, we cannot grow. Then the second part I wanted to talk about and really add on to what you were saying, Shannon, is that we have to do more work with our families and parents. They need to be better informed. This past December, I helped organize with the Charter School Advocates about 15 different charter schools where we had our parents informed on the funding issues for charter schools. And we had 60 parents speak at the governor's listening session. And once we told parents about the funding discrepancies, they were shocked. They didn't know. They were upset. They were agitated, right? And so then we had a group of 20 to 40 parents who then wanted to meet with the Joint Finance Committee members, which they did. And they led these meetings asking for more funding. And what we saw is they said, if more families knew about these issues, they would want change, right? And we need it from their communities, right? They didn't know that their representatives in their local district also were not for charter schools. And it was very shocking to them. they want now to do more. And so I think we have to do a better job of informing parents in all of our communities on the issues so that they can make the decisions to go out and vote for their school board members and for the representatives. That's where the real change happens, is with our families.
Thank you. We are out of time, so I will end. My priest actually walked into the back. I don't know where he went, Father Jim. So I'll end with a confession and then a question. The first, I think, gets to Jim's point. I think as I struggled through this and tried to talk to educational experts and dealt with this tension between how prescriptive do you be with curriculum, or what's the federal role versus the state role versus local. The intellectual roadblock I would always hit is the question you raised, Jim, which is the role of parents and families, right? Put differently, let's just assume that by 2025, we did everything you want to do, Gus, or everything we agree upon, and we have a better, more transparent funding model, and we recruited all the best teachers, in America and Wisconsin, and we're getting kids in the workforce and all this stuff, everything we talked about. If families continue to fail, are we always just going to be playing catch up, right? I mean, because families are upstream of education as a policy agenda. Now, I believe education is the best sort of dam you can place in that stream and fix the cycle over time. But that's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to find a legislative fix to. And what do we demand of parents? Certainly, I think it's reasonable to demand they pay more attention to their school choice and what their kids are learning than what they pay to how they select what to watch on Netflix every night. But I'm not sure we should ask working parents to have to police curriculum every single day, right? They should have some reasonable expectation that they don't have to do that. So I just want to recognize that tension, and I totally take your point. And I want to end by asking a simple question of every panelist. You have to have a short answer, though, because we're already 3 minutes over time. And I'm going to go in reverse order, starting with Shannon. Okay, you get to wave a magic wand, and you get to fix one aspect of our educational system in Wisconsin. What do you spend that wand wave on? I didn't prepare them for this. So if you want to stall for time, I can call them.
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is obviously the funding gap. It costs Milwaukee Lutheran $11,300, I think, every year to educate one student. The voucher, I think, is $8,700. It's my job, one of my jobs, to go out and figure out a way to make up that gap. It's a lot of time and effort invested in that, but also if we had those resources with the creative people that we have at Milwaukee Lutheran, I just can't even imagine the difference we would make in a kid's life.
Yeah, great answer. Will?
So Susan brought up earlier the fact that there's never been a choice program where it's as easy to sign up for choice as it is for the public school. Obviously, there's always going to be some affirmative action that's required for a parent to enroll their student in choice. But if I had a magic wand, I think the thing that would do the most good, is the Green Bay superintendent brought up as well, that we do have some parents that aren't fully involved. Well, if we could make the process as simple as you must choose a box, you must check, the public school box, you must check the box for the choice school, some sort of a mechanism where there's no hoops to jump through, a mechanism where any parent has the same opportunity to select the school as any other. You don't need to go through a lot of research. You don't need to prove your income like you do for the current program. I think that would be the most transformational change, because even those parents that have the limited resources to search for information, then they can make these choices relatively easily.
Thank you. Joseph?
Develop programs like CareerWise Colorado, where teenagers are moving toward diploma achievement while having significant compensated work-based learning in areas of their interest through apprenticeships at employers.
Great. And Robert, you get the last word.
All roads lead to early childhood literacy. The vast weight of the talent and energy in the system has to be aimed at literacy K1 and 2. I used to tell my fifth graders all the time, it's easier to keep up than to catch up. If a child is not reading on grade level by the end of third grade, we know that they are something like 90% likely to never be reading on grade level. We know how to solve that problem. That's what we should be doing. That's where our primary focus should be, is getting kids to the starting line.
Great. Well, thank you first to the audience members for such a engaging discussion and debate. And please join me in thanking our excellent panelists for helping facilitate this discussion. So, great. Thank you, Will. Appreciate it. Shannon, thank you. You are now both free to go. Wait, before everyone heads for the cocktails, and Shannon, you don't have to stand up here anymore if you don't want to, but you're welcome to if that's it. Yeah. We have one more person to speak, but before Rick comes up here, I just want to thank again Notre Dame and Principal Molly. Where are you? Did she probably has? Oh, there in the back. Yeah. Thank you so much for this. Kim with the Grace School System. Thank you so much for making this happen. And someone I should have thanked before, Carl and Mary Ellen Keeney for their generosity in helping put this all together. Thank you so much. I see everything you do for this community. It's great. So, AEI, you've been a phenomenal resource. I really appreciate it. But it really is hard, I think, for me to overstate how critical the work that the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty does. There's really nothing like it in Wisconsin. And when I began this journey, it was really Will that helped me, and guided me and just really helped me ask some of the right questions. And so as a policymaker, every single day I lean on Will for support. And so thank you to Will for everything you do for the state of Wisconsin. It is really, really appreciated. And it would not be possible were it not for the leadership of Rick Essenberg, who is the founder, the president, the chief sewer of Dane County at times. But Rick, you've just been phenomenal in your leadership. I want to thank you, and I cede the floor to you, sir.
Well, thank you. Look, don't worry. I know it's me, and I'm a litigator, but I'm hardly going to say anything at all. One of my throwaway lines is that I've reached the point in life where a good part of my job is to take credit for what younger people do. And they've worn me out again today. But my job right now is to just thank you all for coming. We at Will are very proud to be able to sponsor an event like this. In so much of our public life today, we are fervently devoted to the project of screaming at each other, but not today. Today, we heard thoughtful conversations between political, school, civic, and business leaders. And it's those type of conversations that are going to wind up helping kids. And you can call me old-fashioned. Most of my younger colleagues do. But I fervently believe that. Over the past year and a half, some things went right, but a lot of things went wrong. And Wisconsin is a great place to live, but we can do better when it comes to the education of our kids. And at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, we are committed to providing legal and policy support and working together with our partners, many of you of whom you've heard from today, in making that happen. Because together, I think we can do this. I want to thank AEI and CERN for helping to sponsor this event. I would be remiss if I didn't thank my colleagues, Libby Sobek, Kyle Conan, Eric Searing, who's here somewhere, but I don't know where, and Leslie Loers for putting this together. I'd like to thank Carl and Mary Ellen Keeney for the support that they provided to this event. And finally, I would like to thank Congressman Gallagher for leading the call on this, for, as we said, I think, before we began this afternoon, for sticking his neck out. And you still have it, so that's good. And still have your head. And finally, I would like to thank you all for participating and listening to this important conversation. And now you can hit the bar.